How do you say it? Good evening. I'd like to call to order our 6 o'clock work session, and we will start our enrollment and budget update with Kathy Johnson. All right.
Oh, GR and Kelly were over there with Paula. Am I supposed to talk into something? Okay. So what I've got is a little bit of catch up, or kind of where we are now, based on where we started off with budgeting. And then what we do know about, excuse me.
Oh, cute. That was exciting.
Wake up! Just kidding. And then what we do know about next year, and kind of where we are in that side. So sort of a review. If a lot of this is information that's sort of, I try to do kind of over and over. Some of it you'll know, some of it you may have questions about. But just tell me either to slow down or speed up. So the first thing I always like to remind you is that our timeline of enrollment and actual current year budget impact, we approved this back in July, August based on projections. So our first opportunity to have kind of real numbers is the September 20 count. And that's our first revision of enrollment and projections. Beginning this year, though, budget was actually based on last year's audit. And the weightings are based on this year's audit. So it made it a little bit different. We certify our mill levy and our valuation in October, and then sometime between December and April, they'll come out and audit us. We actually have been audited, so I'm using those numbers. They're not necessarily our final legal max, because we don't typically get that till June, when they do some of the special state aids of SPED and virtual, because virtual kids won't flush completely out until all school districts in Kansas are audited, just because of that. And then and so I mentioned that in June. So a little bit about our enrollment. Headcount is what I'm going to go over first. Headcount is different than what we're budgeted on. And if you look at our building enrollment and our virtual enrollment from 12-13 to 17-18, you're going to see that our enrollment in Lawrence is really actually pretty darn flat. Yes. It's not necessarily big growth. So when we look at Lawrence and the community and it feels like we are just growing and growing and growing, we might be with real estate and building and the university, but in our schools, our enrollment has actually, it's gone up almost 200 kids, but that's over a 6-year period. So it's not significant. And then you can kind of see what that's done in the graph below. We also will tend to get a lot of transfer. So we'll get a lot transfer out, a lot transfer in. We might be seeing new kids, but we're not necessarily seeing new kids as growth. It's just replacement. So the next sheet that I'm going to share with you is taking our actual audited head count. And this is a snapshot of our buildings. And so you can see the buildings are down the side here. The grades are across the top. This is the current year head count by building. And then you'll see last year's kind of same time and the change by building and by total. The same thing with the middle schools, the high school, and then you'll see the virtual school. And then our grand total enrollment actually was just basically 11 different. These are some additional enrollment numbers that the auditor audits, and that's kind of reconciling back to her number as far as doing that. So, but this is where you'll see what we staff based on actual, we base on projections, but then kind of check ourselves with actual, and then the building per pupil, et cetera, are done on this head count information. Any questions on that? I think most of you have seen this. Yes? Okay. So the next snapshot I'm going to give you is a snapshot of our elementary sections and where we thought we were going to have hot spots. And so this is kind of the snapshot of our staffing in the spring. And this is your thresholds over here for your elementary schools. And so you can kind of see if it's in orange, it was above, and if it's in yellow, it's right at that number. Based on just enrollment and thresholds, we were kind of at that 217 sections or teachers, and that's what you approved. last year coming into this year, as well as we upped the contingency from 8 contingency to 10 last year. If you remember that, we had dropped it and then we brought it back up. So when we staff for these hotspots, we're looking at that contingency. And at this moment in time, it looked like we were going to need 7 contingency FTE to kind of fill hotspots. And then some of the ones that were really close, depending on the building, might have either some title or an at-risk teacher that they could place in there. I think most of you have seen this. So it's K is kindergarten, 1 is first grade, 2 is second grade, etc. So then the next snapshot is what we ended up with when you apply actual enrollment. And you'll see that a lot of those hotspots went away. What's interesting, though, is when you allowed us to make the decision of moving a teacher versus keeping the teacher and then just using that contingency, in some places we get overstaffed, you'll find that this snapshot with just these few hotspots is still 217 FTE. But you'll see, if you look at the 2 sheets together, that there are some buildings that changed. Some went down in enrollment, and you can see that from that earlier sheet where I shared the enrollment, and you could tell which buildings kind of went up and down from the year before. And so we were actually able to redistribute that 217 to our staff, not needing a full 7 contingency, but it ended up being more like 2 or 3. And so you can see that these, what I didn't do is place these extra teachers you'll see. So this is where they actually have an elementary teacher. If they're in the green here, that's either a contingency or a title teacher that they actually have to go back and fix or help with these hotspots. So for example, Langston Hughes had a contingency teacher, and they would have gone back and filled in for kindergarten, and that would have gone away. Does that make sense? And they do have 4 sections of kindergarten. So you can kind of tell where the hot spots are, and then you can tell if I have something over here, and you kind of look back down the line where the likely place is that they filled that or fixed that section or that kind of hot spot. We're still going through staffing meetings, and I know they're still working through that, and I don't have a final snapshot of this, but it gives you enough of a kind of view of where it was at projection time, where it is at actual, and where we're still kind of being able to work on some of those hot spots. Does that help a little bit in kind of seeing? But we did not have to use the full 7 that we thought we were going to in the spring, because when enrollment came in, enrollment for elementary actually dropped 60-some kids. So by redistributing, we were able to not have to overstaff or to not overstaff in a building and then be able to help a building that actually grew more than expected. Does that kind of make sense? Yes? Okay. So the next one I'm going to go into is kind of working with, this is kind of a common one that we show you a little bit with the enrollment and the sections and thresholds. So the next one I'm going to talk about is weighted FTE, which is going to get us into budget. Okay. So enrollment headcount is used for staffing in our building per pupil budgets, but a weighted FTE is what we use to calculate the district's legal max budget. So base enrollment FTE is a full-time student that's enrolled and attending 360 minutes on September 20. If they're a block schedule, then they use the full week to kind of make sure that they're doing that. And it's evaluating the minutes that way. 17-18 budget is going to be based on what was audited FTE 920 of 16, our prior year. They counted kindergarten 1.0, and KSDE gave us that based on their audit of kindergartners instead of 0.5, because that funding was changing coming into this year under the new formula. 18-19 is going to be based on the audited FTE of 920-17, so I know that number. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Kindergarten is funded full-time, or it's prorated if it's less than 1.0 FTE. So again, then when they come in and they audit it, they look at all those minutes and calculate that to determine what that FTE is going to be. Any questions with that? Well, the good news is our base enrollment, we actually know what to use for next year. That was part of the finance formula change. That can be good and bad, but that's what we do know, that number. The other part then of what calculates our legal max, unlike the base enrollment, are the following weightings and special state aid. And they are going to be based on audited 17-18 information for the current year. So we really don't know what they are for 18-19 until 18-19 is audited. And We don't really have much of an estimate or a change of any of that information except for based on the audited information. You'll see a little bit of that as we go forward. Those special weightings are things for at-risk 4-year-old program, our bilingual program, career and technical education, at-risk K-12, new facilities, which is one-time money, and CAMS, which is if we have a student enrolled at the Fort Scott or Fort Hayes Math and Science Academy, we get the base data per pupil, and then we turn around and send it to Fort Hayes. The state aid calculations, which are no longer, they back into a weighting, or FTE, are special ed and cost of living, and then virtual, they don't even calculate an FTE for us in the formula anymore. They just calculate a state aid amount and tack it on at the bottom. So those are kind of the other part of the budget. All that should be kind of familiar to you. So what I'm going to do next is take what we planned when we published and where we've ended up with actual, see how we got there, and then kind of review what we did for this year's budget. So our legal max budget authority for 16-17 is this number here. General fund, our LOB, and a total. Our audited out, and again, it's not final, but based on this initial audit, it's the 74,700 and the calculated LOB for this number here. The change is this 7,129,000. We back out for purposes of planning and budget that we can use ongoing the new facilities. That's money that's going to go away. And it's the general fund part, and then we also get the 33% LOB. So it's a one-time use, but if we commit it to ongoing costs when it goes away, then we don't have the funds. So we take that out of the equation. And then our planned budget authority, so it gives us a net number. Our planned budget authority, when we looked at the budget for planning and working with you, was about 6,164,000. So we came out a little bit ahead, which is good. I never want to see a negative number here. That always means that we actually planned and committed more than we ended up with when we were all said and done. So that will just go towards some deficit spending or things that are in place that we didn't have a budget or a commitment to. Any questions on how that works? That's just taking you from our guesstimating and kind of taking against what actually happened and finding where we ended up there. So the snapshot next is what that budget plan looked like that we were going to use that $6.1 million last year. So this is sort of that summary page. You can see over here there's our 6.1. That's the net of additions and reductions. And this is what we used it for. We did wages, health insurance. We put back those two contingency at elementary and secondary. This was FTE change at the elementary, middle, high school, and ESL. One was due to just an enrollment change, and the high school and middle school, we actually changed the ratio to make that decrease. And then the ESL went down just a little bit. The next in green is sort of that whole restructure that we did of different positions. That had a net impact. And then we have some non-wage things and some things that were targeted specifically in deficit spending, and then sort of whatever was left when everything fell through was that number in orange that was to those other things that we committed that we were using cash balances for in those prior years during block grant. We have about 130,000 more when all was said and done, so that'll go towards that 571 and kind of help with that. That all kind of reminder makes sense?
Okay, I want to make sure for Kelly and GR, because this is the first time that you've seen this. If you have questions, or even if it's you can't even formulate a question because because it's that, we can pause and talk about it for a minute.
Not fault.
Okay, good. All right.
Not following.
Okay.
And this is basically what you all made as the pluses and minuses to take where we were with budget, add and plus, and get to an ending based on what we knew we could do and based on the new money that the state gave us. So the next one, let's talk a little bit about where are we with deficit spending. So here's that number at the top that I said we ended up with. When we look at all of our contracted wages, employer costs being FICA, Medicare, unemployment, workers' comp, 403B, and our health insurance, it's about 1,618.74 FTE. That's classified certified administrators. That's our whole pool of FTE. It's about 85 million, and it's about 85% of that total. And then we have some early retirement, some stipends. We contract with Morgan Hunter for substitutes, et cetera. And that's kind of this next piece to about this much of our budget. And then we have kind of these non-wage expenditures, transportation, utilities, just different department budgets, school building budgets, and those all total about 17. To about 105 is where we're at. Well, that would be that we're in excess of that 99. We also know that we have some additional revenues that are outside the budget authority or that legal max that we need to take into account. We get about $2.4 million in federal grant money that helps offset some of our SPED staff that's up in this number. JDC expenditures are all on a state aid reimbursement basis, so although they're in our general fund expenditures, we get that reimbursement back for them. We collect fees for transportation, participation, co-curricular at about $235,000, so that's a credit against some of those expenditures. Our forfeitures, I just kind of put an average number in there that we would target. It may be a little higher than that. If it is, it just helps the bottom number. We have some administrative claiming Medicaid money that is a reimbursement back in the general fund, and it runs at about $100,000 a year. And then we get towards our early childhood at risk, which is one of our weightings in that $99 million, some donation money that helps support that program, and so that can help there too. So budget credits, resources outside that legal max is about 3.2 on an estimate. Again, we're in March, and we still have the rest of the year to go. So deficit would look about 2.8, but you have to remember in this 99 is new facility money. So if I took that out of the equation, because at some point it's going away, I'm at 3.4. Our deficit spending is coming down because if you remember, we were closer to 5.5 million. So we're making progress, but we still have a chunk out there that we're dealing with. And my contingency reserve is now down to $3.6 million, which is just barely above our deficit. Any questions on that?
The contingency reserve of 3.6, is that have you already taken out the 3.4?
No.
Okay.
That is what it was on July 1. So if we end up with that as a deficit this year end, potentially could come out of the reserve, or if there's any cash balance or some other reimbursement that can help us, we would try to obviously go there first. We'll try to go to contingency as a last resort because we're trying to maintain that to help with cash flow and just not knowing what might happen.
Okay, got it.
Any questions then on that? Okay, so a little bit about assessed valuation. Our assessed valuation went up about 3.86. That's just kind of a table of what it has done over time. If you were to go back further in the early 2000s, you'll see like 10s and 12% increases. But when it started to go down, it's coming back, but it's not like it used to be where it was jumping big, huge percentages. The mill levy came in at officially about 0.9 or just under 1 mil less than what we published, which is good. That means kind of as the assessed valuations all settled and things finalized, which is the direction we want it to go. We don't ever want to kind of have it come in at a higher number because that is problematic with the amount of resources we need in a specific fund. I don't know if you have any questions about that, but that's just sort of a general update on that. Are we good with that? Okay. So we're going to talk now, move into 17-18 projections, unless you have questions on this. So as you remember, audited 16-17 is what our 17-18 FTE is. This is our audited enrollment for the current year, which we'll use for next year, which is 10.695.6 right now. So it actually is down 9.2. We're anticipating that the 4-year-old at risk will be about the same, and thus the high-low enrollment is based on those numbers above, so it's just changing slightly because they did. Your bilingual FTE, your career and tech are based on contact minutes with ESL students or the contact minutes with vocational. For right now, they're estimated to be basically exactly the same. I don't have an idea because scheduling hasn't been completed as to how many kids are enrolled in certain college and career classes, so we really don't have a guesstimate yet on what those contact minutes might be. And with the ESL or the bilingual criteria changing on kids, we need to see kind of who tests out and who's still going to be eligible for that next year, so we don't have an estimate yet. And as we move through the year, or move closer to the end of the school year, we'll get those numbers. But for today's exercise, they're exactly the same. At risk, K-12 is based on free lunches in the school district unless you're over 21 or you're part-time in grades 1 through 12. Then you don't get to count, and virtual free kids don't get to count. So they figure that weighting. And then high density, we have some buildings, if you're between 30 and 50%, we get a little bit extra weighting, and if you're above 50, we get a little bit extra weighting in free and lunch count. And so we have a little bit of FTE conversion there. Transportation is just based on our 175.2 square miles of a school district, how many kids are transported over 2.5 miles, or not transported, but transported or offered. And then it gets to a density factor, and then there's so much money in the transportation pool of state aid, and they figure out then what districts will get from that. And then convert it to an FTE. And then new facilities, we're going to see the first big drop. It's going to go 156.3 down to about 63. We're down to only some students in the new facilities at Pinckney next year, 1 classroom at Schwegler and a couple classrooms at Sunflower, and then we have no more new facility money. So this is the first kick out of that money. And after 18-19, we won't have new facility money. It's not built into the new formula going forward on any bond issues. So our 2018 bond issue that was passed will not be able to generate any new facility money. Unless, of course, they come back with something different when the state court decides, or the courts decide late in May. So that gets us sort of this weighted FTE before special education and cost of living. And then those two, the cost of living is converted from a dollar amount that you see there. That's the maximum we're allowed for our district. And it just takes the base, divides by the base state aid, and that's the FTE. Kansas in there is just the 1. And then special education, again, it's a dollar amount that's calculated and divided by the base state aid per pupil, and it calculates to the FTE. So when it's all said and done, our weighted FTE for current year, and then what it's calculated to be next year, times the base state aid per pupil, that is going up just this little bit. That's all that the law is saying so far. You get a dollar amount. State aid for virtual, we're anticipating it to be the same. They haven't changed the calculation. That enrollment has been pretty consistent. So right now, unless, as we, like I said, as we get further into the end of the school year, these numbers can vary a little bit, but this is just the snapshot as of now. So based on this, our general fund legal max would projected of new money for next year above this year's money of only $1,753,987 in current law. Does that all make sense? I know it's a lot of numbers to go through, but it kind of lays out where they're coming from and how the calculation would come to fruition. The next page then is taking what is our weighted FTE for LOB purposes, takes out virtual, and it takes out SPED. You get your 4490, because it's a false base. This base is actually the base we should be at for funding purposes. And if the formula for general fund ever gets to this level, then as they both increase, this would change again. But for right now, as long as it's above the general fund, it will be that. And then they take the higher of the 0809 special education or the current year, and our current year is obviously higher. So you add those together to get an adjusted or a different general fund value, 33%, and then that's your LOB. And the difference between the two will give us about that much money. So when you look at it together, general fund and LOB, and general fund and LOB, that's our new money that we know of under current law that we have to work with for next year. Don't have any insight as of today for any changes to the current law as a result of the cost study, the court decision, the adequacy rulings, nothing. That's anticipated to be late May, June, potentially. We might start to see, as the legislature gets towards that court date, some idea of what they're thinking. But at this point, there's nothing but kind of random, Brownback saying, sure, they should have more education or, in his budget plan, but no resources and no formula to apply it to. Nothing's come through the legislature in a bill or anything to change anything. So all we know today is current law, and that's what current law would provide us.
From a historical perspective, what historically speaking, how does the increase, I mean, is that a low number from year to year? Is that on par?
It's so long since we've had normal that I'm not sure that I could tell you.
Okay, fair enough. That's as good an answer as any.
Honestly, the block grant, kind of made it flat. Actually, it is probably pretty normal if you go back to previous years, because Lawrence doesn't grow in enrollment. If you see that history, there's been years we've decreased, and even though the base state aid went up, the enrollment went down. So that's sort of and the only time you would see a big increase is if there was a formula change that created a base state aid per pupil kind of jump. But if you look at just the norm based on our enrollment trend and kind of how that works, it's not that abnormal, but it's not a huge jump in our base state aid either. And it's one of those two factors that's going to drive your dollars up.
Okay.
You either have to grow in enrollment or the base state aid per pupil has to go up. And those two things are kind of what's going to drive your new money. Otherwise, you're flat amount of.
Okay.
That makes sense? Yeah. I wish it was different, but that's the way it is for school finance. So, and we don't have other ways to generate. We can't, create a new number. So the next thing that I'm going to share with you a little bit is things that are probably already out there that need to be addressed against this new money. And so when you look at our new funding, when we did the elementary need maintaining ratio, there was no FTE even going forward into 18-19. So based on where elementary is and based on how our calculation of sections on projected, we're still at that same place, not up or down, assuming the ratio stays exactly the same. At the middle school, because if you remember in our table before, some of our enrollment growth is happening in the middle and the high. So when you apply the ratio from last year, not 2 years ago, but just last year, just to maintain that ratio, they're going to need about a half an FTE. And for the high school, they're going to need 3.5. And that's just to maintain ratios. ESL is actually looking at a decrease in FTE. To maintain a PE teacher that we're slightly overstaffed on would be that 0.4. We hired mid-year of 17-18 the communication specialist, so to keep it permanent and ongoing in a funding, with a funding, would need to be put in here. We ended up pulling back at 0.6 of a nurse facilitator, so in order to keep that permanent and ongoing, we would need to add that back in. The cut. There is a vacant maintenance and grounds that they're trying to look at hiring back as a general manager, a grounds manager position. There's an actual slight change in the cost of that position, so that's in there. And then you did a 1-year approval of the Gen Y tech team stipends at the middle school. That was a budget cut a while back. You reinstated it for the current year, but if you're going to keep it permanent and ongoing beyond this year, we would need to add that back in permanently. Those are kind of the things that I know are kind of already happened, that if we want to keep them going into 18-19, we would need to plan on. And that's about $277,000 net of the adds and the minuses, and down takes our $1.7 million we know of down to that number. Questions on that part? All right, so the next thing is we have asked staff to submit any budget considerations, additions or reductions by March 15th. So we'll circle back around with you at a later time to review and discuss some of those requests. Again, not knowing where funding is, part of it is having the request, prioritizing what those might be, so that if we do have more money than just current law provides, then you would have a way to kind of go down that list and see what those needs are in a priority fashion. Each of the requests, when they come in, we've asked them to give us the amount of the consideration, if it's an add or a reduction, what board goal it impacts, the current situation, and then who will be affected and what effect will have on those parties, as well as impact to HR. So is it an FT in a position, or is it a non-wage type need? And then if there's a domino effect of it happening, what is it, and is there a way to minimize that? So that's kind of what we're asking for, some support of the why for the request. So we'll have to circle back around on that with you, but those are kind of out there. And it was just, it's what's out there on the table. Where does staff feel like we have some needs, so that we can bring those in front of you for review and take a look at that. So then the next one to go over with you is some budget considerations that the board has shared with Anna. So I tried to, and that I think have had various discussions, so Anna can help where
I'll chime in.
Yeah. So I think there's been some kind of curriculum discussions that kind of have pluses and minuses to them. There's some things with equity, student services, facilitator area. Then there was a question about if we went to a full-time guidance counselor at each elementary, what that would look like. And changing just kindergarten and first grade by 1 was, I believe it's about 4. And we'll have to double check after we've got some staffing things going on right now. But so just putting that out there for right now. And then the other thing that surfaced, but just not really have dollars tied to, would be security, whether it's contracted or a security supervisor kind of position. And there may be other things that are needed beyond that. I think that's one of the budget considerations that we haven't received yet from, I know, for the middle school. So just looking at that, it's about this amount of money. And so just kind of wanted to get it out there. There's some things you can think about if you wanted to with like the K1, we've got a contingency of 10. If you reduce the contingency in order to change that threshold, you're probably accomplishing what you want to with the contingency now. So it kind of is a wash with that. That's probably where your contingency is going anyway, and it may wash. But that would be making a decision ahead of knowing anything more than you know tonight. The same could be said, I guess, with guidance, but kind of if you add something, you got to take something off at this point until we know we have actual solid, idea of some money. Also know that's spending. So, and I don't know what you might want to add.
The only thing that I will add is in my individual conversations, some collectively, some areas of need based on where we're trying to go with board goals and in the future. That's where these additional positions have come from. So the curriculum facilitators would be in the core content areas, so that as we are looking at reviewing and continuing to maintain and sustain a viable curriculum, these are teachers on extended with additional days. The equity facilitator, I know I've talked to a few people, and as we've looked at our equity work and where we have had successes and challenges, we've just talked about that's a lot for one person to shoulder. And we've discussed, internally, as I spoke with Leah and others, that probably splitting it, elementary, secondary, and that way you have more of a team around. Looking at the equity work and providing the support throughout the district, and it's not just one individual. The student service facilitator, we put student services, but thinking about our TI3T plan and our mental health support and those initiatives to carry that forward. There are some parts when you look at our CI3T plan that is difficult, honestly, for Leah and Kevin and student services to continue to maintain with fidelity. So this would be to ensure that some of those things that when things come up and I'm like, well, we should be doing that would help close some of those gaps around that. And then the guidance counselors is that mental health, social emotional part. Right now in our elementaries, we either have counselors or social workers, and so that all falls together. So ensuring that there was a full-time person in all of the buildings. And I will say with that, our larger elementaries do have a 1.0. We are talking about some of our smaller to mid-size where they have like 0.8 or 0.6. By adding 3, we'll be able to ensure that everyone had someone in their building full-time. And then the threshold change, some of you may recall, like last year at the beginning of the school year, you got lots of emails because, there were large class sizes in kindergarten. This would address that. And as Kathy said, when we talked about, we could look at just reducing the contingency to address that. And then that's where it's coming from. That would make that number a little smaller, but for both of those. But then the risk you run from doing all of it out of contingency is because we're funded on projections from last year. If we get a ton of people to move into Lawrence, we would have contingency to go to. I mean, we still would have 3, but you just run that risk if you take all of that out of contingency. But that is an option to do. And then the security supervisor, when Tony and the others give their report, as we've looked at our structure and as times have changed, ensuring that we have somebody who is committed to that, to make sure those plans are updated, that can help us make sure that we are training and implementing best practices to ensure that our students and our campuses are safe. And when we looked at districts that we're not as large as some and bigger than others, that was an area that we feel like we do need to allocate somebody to do that full time. And it wouldn't just be security, it'd be like all of our emergency planning, like fire safety and all of those things. And right now is just kind of falling with honestly Ron's position, and there's a bunch of other stuff. So in order to give the attention to detail that we need, we are thinking that we probably need someone full-time to work with our security guards, to be a liaison with the SROs and other measures. So that's just kind of in the nutshell. At the top, the director of middle school, that's actually Jennifer Besselow's position, and we would have Rick Henry to become the director of secondary, and so he would absorb the middle school, so that there is a administrator, which Jennifer's position would be reduced to 0.65 to facilitate and lead all of that with the teachers when we look at our curriculum and what needs to occur on an ongoing and regular basis.
I did notice there's a formula thing here, so it should be the 3,000, not the 1 in front of it. So there's a $10,000 you can add back over here. It just jumped out at me. The other thing with the contingency swap, staffing early, trying to hire, and waiting is always a pickle.
Yeah.
We don't know if we're going to get new funding. I'm assuming that there will be something out of the adequacy. Can't tell you what. So even if you chose to do, say, contingency, lower it to offset it, if the dollars came in, that could be one of your first priorities to add back too. So you can kind of think strategically that way. Just because the timing of hiring can sometimes be, waiting till June or the beginning of school, it's a lot harder than now. So those are some things to think about.
And do you have a question? The only other thing I was going to say, and the reason we're bringing these specific ones, these are all positions that we probably would need to post and start to hire, because if we wait until June, we're not going to have a very good pool for any of the teaching, counseling positions. We ran into it this year where when we wanted to hire for Langston, it was late and we never found anyone. And so it just gets late. So that's why I know it's a risk because you don't know what the money will be. We do know what we will have based off of the current formula, but to say move forward with that, we would probably need to post and start hiring, or if we said in June, we probably wouldn't be able to hire for most of them because the quality of the candidate diminishes great.
Counselors and the facilitators.
Yes.
And for the contingency positions, is that something, we can either, we may not even need we may not use any of those, right?
Well, if we change the threshold, we would, because we would be saying that we're not going to let K1 go over 24. So we would go in the places where it's right there, we would lower it. And based off our projections, it's about 4 sections that we would need to add across the district. There are some places where they're not even close, so we wouldn't have to worry about.
It just really depends on where people shift around within the community and where the hotspots are. And that's something
Yeah.
that's decided right,
Yeah.
like around enrollment time.
Yes, but last year we ran into an issue where we couldn't hire, even though we were going to use contingency, it was late and there were no viable candidates to fill the position. Yeah.
This number down here is not above what you have left on the other page, but again, it's the risk of if nothing else comes to you, you know, what else? So we're in a very hard time, you know, as far as if the state would have settled all this last year, it would have been really nice. So we're kind of stuck in that no man's land a little bit. I've got to throw one more thing at you, though, because this is something we do need to keep in mind. I don't know whether it'll come to fruition, but it does have an impact on us, and a significant one. And some of you may have heard of it. It's called a dark store theory. Just kind of gone behind the scenes, and then all of a sudden people are starting to hear a little bit about it. It's a theory out there that's in front of the tax appeals that's basically your big box stores thinking that they are unfairly and overassessed with the current appraisal practices, and they feel like their assessed valuation should be at the level as if they were dark and unencumbered by leases, not vibrant stores. And so that would significantly change the commercial value in our assessed valuation. And Douglas County did do an estimate. It's significant, I think, community-wide, but specific to Lawrence, it's $7,760,020 of tax revenue that would be not realized out of, for example, our 55.95 mill levy. And if it occurs after the mill is set, then the size of the tax adjustment has to come in the current year of expected revenue and causes some pickles. And you have to look at it fund by fund because each fund that has a mill levy is a little bit different. So the 2.7, so what I did was here's our mill levy. Here's the amount of tax revenue. And off of 20 mills, you know, it's 2.7. Local options, the 16 mills. All of this goes to the state, and the state turns around and funds us back all the way up to our legal max. So if there's less tax revenue, then they're just coming up with more state aid. It doesn't really impact us in our general fund, but think about the state, who now has an unexpected expense of Douglas County, Johnson County, big numbers. And so they're already complaining they don't have enough money. This will just make it worse for them. Our LOB is where our biggest pickle is, because that would be any unencumbered cash, and if that couldn't suffice, which it wouldn't, we would have to dip into contingency for whatever the deficit is between what we actually realize in our collections of what we do collect, state aid, and then what's left of our authority to be able to spend our full authority. If we don't spend our full authority, then our state aid is prorated down also, so has a couple of different domino effects. So that's the biggest one. Bond and interest, I checked, our unencumbered cash would cover the loss just barely to get us through that 18-month. But what that means, and the same with your LOB, is the next year you're going to see a mill levy increase, because the only way to generate enough revenues to offset the lowered assessed valuation is a higher mill levy. And so you're going to see mill levies really across the state increase in all communities to offset the drop in the assessed valuation to generate the same amount of revenue that they need in their current budget. So it's pushing off commercial and onto non-commercial and residential the tax burden by this particular tax appeal. You won't see anything really impacted in adult ed. Capital outlay, it's a flat lid. We get what we get off of 8 mills, which just means we'll get less. And so your project ability would be a little bit smaller. And the cost of living the first year, we may or may not make our authority based on collections. And then the next year, you'd probably see an increase in your mill levy to generate the same amount of dollars because you're doing it on the lower tax base. So this is out there, and it's just one of those things that's in tax appeals. I know the city and the county have been involved in some communications. I know Johnson County, when I found out about it kind of late last week, was Blue Valley was kind of doing a little poll. Shawnee Mission, you know, have you heard about this? What have you checked with your county to see what the loss of revenue is, and what do we do? So it is something to keep in mind, because in light of everything else, if it were to happen, they just tax adjust in the current year whenever it happens, and they just revenue resources away that we might be planning on for something else.
So Kathy, the tax appeals that are going on over this, are those happening in Johnson County?
Primarily, I think.
Do we have any?
Started.
Do we have any that are ongoing in Douglas County that we know about?
I don't know that there's any going on. I think the calculation was based on what if it happens, what it would look like. I do know they are going on in Johnson County, because that's where it surfaced quite a while ago, I guess a lot sooner than some of the rest of us, because it was a phone call, you know, to them early on.
Because I've seen a little bit of chatter about this starting late last week also, because there was this news story on this. I think the Shawnee Mission Post did a news story on it. So, and I'm not as familiar with the appeals process with the tax. So if this theory were to win out in the appeals that are ongoing in Johnson County, that just affects Johnson County for now, correct? It's not as if they decide that appeal and it applies to any property across the state.
I can't answer that 100%, because
Okay.
I think if they would change it, then they would actually change the calculation, and it would apply statewide at that point. So if the appeal's won, it's kind of like a court ruling,
And that's a state.
and then the state would change it.
If you appraise it for its market value, or if you appraise it for the, you know, brick and mortar empty.
Right.
It may
So
not be immediate, but then within the
it
year.
would be the domino effect of it, but people would have to go through the appeals process.
I don't know if they would, if they decided that by law this is a misassessment, then I don't think it's going to require an appeal. I think they'll just reassess the next time they assess properties at this formula instead of the existing.
I guess I'm just trying to gauge when the impact could potentially
I think that's the unknown we're all worried about, because I don't think we have an answer to that question
All right.
at this point, and because I don't know.
Okay.
So I guess one of my questions about this is, I know the city has written a letter to the committee looking at it, and the county and the city are talking about it. We're going to have our joint meeting. We certainly should have this as an agenda item. But do we need to have some sort of concerted effort, just for advocacy purposes, to be against changing how they're appraising these big box stores?
If a store owner were to file a protest, they could file a protest in June, it could affect this year. They would have to file a protest. If this theory is adopted, then as the counties go back, and if the state says, you know, this is a viable way of valuing that type of property, then they would go through and prospectively start doing that. So if it's a viable theory, I would argue that if I'm a business owner, I'm going to adopt that, and I'm going to file an appeal with the Board of Tax Appeals through the county. I'm going to protest my taxes and try to get my value dropped. Could have a more definite effect in a shorter term period if you had, you know, the Targets and all of the big stores down south of here were to do that, then it could have an impact this year.
One of the things that you can do to help, if you know that that's happening or somebody's appealing and it's a large kind of an appeal, the county will sometimes say, plan on a delinquency of something much different than the 3% that's our norm. So maybe it's a 20% delinquency but that's going to shoot your mill levy up. But what happens then is you have the revenues there if those taxes don't get paid. That's the only offset to it. And I say that as a big number, but I don't know what, 7.
So one way potentially that this could be approached would be to be working with the county between now and the time we set our mill levy in August, and have them and calculate in the larger delinquency rate. That would be one way to safeguard against.
If it was pretty for sure.
Okay.
Otherwise, you might be taxing and not needing to, and so there's that balance of
Right.
do that. So,
Okay.
but it is something to keep an eye on. I think it is something to advocate against.
Really, when we talk about advocating, it's really not unless the legislature would have passed some provision. I mean, we operate on a fair market value system on property tax. And so if ultimately the Board of Tax Appeals determines that this theory results in a value that is representative of fair market value for commercial property, unless the state were to change from a fair market value basis, I'm not sure that there's legislative advocacy that you could employ there.
So just to make sure that we're clear about the impacts of this. So the real worry is that they would change the valuation mid-year and we wouldn't be able to adjust the mill levy. But the next time, so assume the valuations all change in the middle of the school year. So we don't get all the tax money. But then when we go to set the mill levy the next time, it's just going to get set how basically the offset is going to come from residential property owners because the formula works in a way that we generate 33% of our general fund and the state, like what we're getting from the state is not going to go down. So the next go round, it would get made up, but it would mean there would be a potentially big impact to residential property owners in their mill levy.
But here's my worry. Given the time frame that it takes to challenge one of these cases, if they file their taxes under protest this year, but they don't resolve that case for a year or two, then you're talking about refunding this year's money in a future year because that taxpayer gets their money back. And we've got a proportionate share of that tax revenue. And so they're going to deduct it on one of your future budgets.
Right.
So your mill levy won't adjust and deal with that until sometime in the future once the property's value is determined. So that's kind of a catch-22 with the way in which our challenges to property can occur because they can file it in June.
That's not different than it has been in.
Oh, it's been that way
Yes, I mean,
since I started working in tax appeals in '82.
It's just a
we've had
significant
properties
change.
that has occurred with, and over time it evens out. But
been a significant.
right.
And usually the 3 to 5% delinquency kind of
Okay.
would create a much larger
Impact.
have the revenues to spend the authority.
Okay.
So that's just another piece of information. What other discussions you need or more information you want or?
Just if you could just go give me 2 or 3 sentences just for clarity, because I'm new and it takes me a while to absorb information. When you were talking about the dark horse theory, could you just explain just in a little bit more detail the impact on capital outlay?
So most of our mill levies are driven by our budget formula. So you get a maximum authority, and whatever the state aid fills, the rest of the bucket's filled with taxes. And so if state aid goes up, then you need less taxes. If the valuation goes up, then you need less mill levy. You still to get the same amount of taxes, but that's your capital outlay is the opposite. We get 8 mills times your assessed valuation, that's your revenue. So 8 mills times a decreased valuation brings in less dollars than 8 mills times the current valuation. So when that valuation changes, if it goes up, it means we get more revenue, but if it goes down, we get less revenue. So that's the difference, is that you get exactly what that mill will raise based on the valuation, where our other mill levies work the opposite. They're dependent upon just filling the rest of that bucket after all other revenues are there.
And that's determined by the state sets that, or?
State formula sets a mill levy cap on our capital outlay, and it's 8.
Okay.
And we have 8 for perpetuity. As far as authority, you can go anything from 0 to 8, but you cannot go over 8.
Without a change in state law about the formula.
The formula statute change to change.
Okay. Thank you.
So I think it would be helpful, because we're about to run out of time. The one thing that we saw on one slide kind of some things we've already talked about. We saw on another slide some things that staff is maybe recommending. What we didn't talk about at all is that we're also going to be asked about salaries here very shortly as we enter negotiations. And then, so there's those things plus the deficit spending that we have to deal with. And so I think having another conversation, really drilling in on the choices that we're going to have to make to address those, particularly because I'm concerned that our deficit spending is still at the level that it's at. The state aid has not increased in the way that I think 4 or 5 years ago when we started doing this, we kind of expected by this point that we would be in a better place than we are. And I'm not going to put all my eggs in the basket of Gannon just yet because we're going to see this Friday the expert, the legislative leadership has hired. Their report is due this Friday, and I'm going to talk about as part of my president's report. We had a pretty lengthy presentation on that from our KASB advocacy staff on Saturday at our board meeting, and I'm not real confident that anybody has any level of comfort that the way they're approaching it is going to be a big positive for districts. So I guess that's where I am. I think we're going to have to.
But we'll definitely circle back around, like at the next one, maybe with an update. We'll have some additional kind of budget considerations about what that report says and what legislatures may do with it.
Mm-hmm.
React to as far as will the courts even accept it, because if they won't, still not where they need to be by the date that's in April.
The end of April, yeah.
So it's just a wait and see game, unfortunately, and I think it's really hard to strategize and plan, and we can kind of get it all together and make some priorities and figure out when you can pull a trigger. What are you going to pull?
Right.
And that's what we're trying to get you some information.
It was very thorough. Thank you very much. Any other questions for Kathy?
So I do have a question. I know there's no action, but some of those positions, and although we will be playing a waiting game, we probably do need to post it at least to have a pool to determine if we were to fill them. We don't have another board meeting scheduled until April 9th, and so we are. So the ones like the counselors and the threshold we talked about, we can use contingency and wait that out. And so
Positions specifically that you're wondering about?
So probably the counselors and the facilitator positions.
The 4 curriculum facilitator positions.
The equity facilitator, yeah. So if there was, so some of them we can post and not interview until after April 9th, but the counselors and those, they dry up pretty quick. Like it's not a plethora of just good people running. So we'll run into spring, like if we post tomorrow, we'll run into spring break. We'll come back a week. Like we minimally probably need to post and at least start to figure out around counselors. And if we're going to change the threshold, definitely teachers.
So, I'm happy to start and say that I'm definitely supportive of the counselors. I think all of our elementary schools need a full-time counselor in the building. I've heard from those people that work in those buildings have to move around. It's really difficult. And some of those buildings are places where we've got kids that are maybe more needy for some of those services. So I think that I'm fully supportive of that. And then, as you know, because we've talked about it at length, so the equity facilitator, just in case somebody doesn't know quite what we're talking about, that would be somebody in addition to Danica Moore to do that work for the district. So right now she is responsible for going out to all of our buildings and working with equity teams and principals. And so this would actually kind of put our money where our mouth is. We talk a lot about doing the equity work, but we've kind of laid a lot on very few people's shoulders. So that's why that would be a position that I also am supportive of.
Can I ask a clarifying question?
Yes.
So I think maybe I missed something. I just want to ask what I saw was the recommendations for those positions were based on conversations you'd had with board members. But we didn't really see recommendations from the district staff, correct?
So we are collecting those, and we'll get the deadline for those are March 15th. And so that's where we said we will wrap back around. And a lot of those from staff, there may be, there will probably be some overlap, but as I've looked at the preliminary list, there are not a lot of like it's time sensitive. You can argue that they're time sensitive. These would be probably more time sensitive because they're actual teachers that we're trying to fill, and some hard to fill. Like if we were to hire another equity facilitator and a CI3 mental health facilitator, more than likely you would want somebody good, and you're pulling them from somewhere. So to be fair to whatever building they're coming from, internally, externally, we would want to give that school an opportunity to backfill.
So I think based on this list that we had, what we would be talking about posting right now, before we really have that chance to have another conversation at the April board meeting, would be the 3 guidance counselors and the equity facilitator and the 4 curriculum facilitators. So here's the...
Yeah, well, so the other one would be, and this is, you can argue back and forth, the mental health CI3T facilitator, I think I would personally equate. Like the curriculum facilitators are important. I'm not trying to weigh one over the other, but when you get to specializing, like around equity and CI3T, your pool shrinks. Curriculum, if we wrap back around, we could post them, not interview, but post them, and then we can see what the interest is, and wait and interview after the next board meeting if it's okay. Some of them we just need to post to see what the interest is, and then to get back to people to tell them the timeline. And especially if it looks like it's going to be internal people, we can have some conversations so that principals are not caught off guard and are being proactive with planning. We don't actually have to hire until we wait and see, but we would have an idea just based on waiting to see what happens with funding and that kind of thing.
I think if the plan would be to post them, but not... What I wouldn't want to see happen is to post them, and then when we come back for our first April meeting, have people on the agenda to approve hirings before we've had a chance to have this further conversation about.
No, the only ones that may possibly happen because of the contingency, I would say, are the counselors and the elementary threshold. The other ones, we wouldn't do that, if that makes sense. Because that can already come out. So if we go over, we would have to address things with contingency anyway.
Because I really, really want to be able to move that elementary threshold, but I'm sort of at a place where if the choice is move the threshold or use contingency staff to do essentially the same thing without adding positions for budget reasons, I don't know that I would think that would be a priority that I would put at the top. Okay. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That's just my thought about it, because I do have a lot of anxiety about how this is all going to shake out in the next 8 weeks. We're kind of over our time, but we need to finish this conversation. So what do other board members think?
I'm a little anxious about the way the numbers are going to fall too, because it sounds like we're have so much more leeway in the past, and now we're really down to a situation where we're using,
we're kind of there. We're kind of there though.
Outside, okay, we want something new. What are we going to cross off? We really, I mean, from what I'm seeing, the direction it's going, and
So are we okay with the counselors and equity facilitator, or?
I feel okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you just describe again what the student service facilitator, what you feel like that particular position would be?
So we all of our mental health and our CI3T, that right now is parceled between like Jose, Leah, and Kevin, and there's not really a point person. And so when we look at the fidelity of what's happened with the CI3T, as we talk about academic and social emotional interventions, some things are falling through the crack. And if there are cracks, and if there was someone there to work with, all of our buildings have a CI3T coach, correct, Kevin, or a leader, like the principal and a teacher. That person can work more directly with them on a more regular basis, sort of like what the equity facilitators do around our equity work.
Okay, so that particular person is going to come from a similar pool to the guidance counselor, because the
Yes.
educational requirements are going to be similar.
Yes.
So if we are looking at balancing, the whole picture, like when we have this conversation about security contract services tonight and security supervisors, we can't really have that conversation without at the same time having a conversation about student service facilitators and looking at things like, when we talk about equity work, we're also talking about understanding trauma-informed care, et cetera.
Yeah, so all of
that
those
stuff
things.
can't be really adequately implemented, like we talk about with fidelity. That's impacting both, that kind of school level stuff and individual classroom, interactions with students as well. So for me, when I look at that equity work, I can't really separate the student service facilitator position. They're closely tied. So when I think if we are prioritizing just looking to see what we have from the pool, that position also would go along with the, if we decided to look at the guidance counselor positions as well.
Melissa, you had some,
Basically,
okay.
I had that written, I had that question written down.
Other thoughts? So we do need to give Dr. Stubblefield some clear guidance on this one. So what I'm hearing people say then is that we would be comfortable with them posting the guidance counselor, the equity facilitator, and the student services facilitator positions at this time, and hold off on, as much as I hate to, hold off on the K1 threshold positions.
Comfortable's not quite.
It's not quite the right word. I understand.
And we, in the interim, if things crop up, we do have the contingency to address hotspots or that kind of thing, and we'll have a little time for that.
Are we offsetting contingency for the guidance counselors FTE until we know whether there's funding, and then you could add the contingency back?
Because if you offset it, you would still have 7 in contingency for elementary, and we did not use all of them this year. Yeah.
Have some room to do that, but that saves you from actually doing an ad, and then if you do have money that comes later, you can take the contingency back up to help with hotspots if we end up being beyond 7.
Okay.
That might be something to think about that at least balances it out for.
Right. I think I'm comfortable with that. Do other board members feel okay with that approach? And I guess I would just throw out that I hope that as we go through the strategic planning process that we're going to be looking at, after July 1, that we really look at those class size thresholds as part of a long-term plan. It's obviously it's hard because we don't know what the state is going to do from year to year, but I think we have to look at that in the future. Okay. Any other thoughts, disagreements? We're good. You feel like you have what you need from us?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Okay. So, thank you, Kathy. I think we'll close out our work session. Anybody want me to call a short break before we start the meeting?
I'm fine.
Good. Okay. All right. So then we will call to order our regular meeting. And the first item that we need to do is approve our agenda.
Move we approve the agenda?
Second.
Favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay. First item up is report of the board president. I do have some things to share, a few items to share regarding some recent activities. On February 27th, which was the day after our last board meeting, I had the pleasure of doing a short interview with Hank Booth on KLWN regarding school safety and security, and we talked about some of the things that I referenced in my president's report at the last meeting, proposals nationally at the state level about addressing gun violence in schools through arming our teachers, and I basically told him what I said in the meeting, that I don't feel that it's an effective response to the issues that are at play there. The Facility Planning Committee, which includes myself and GR as board members, met on March 1st. We received a brief update on bond construction progress, and then spent a lot of that meeting also talking about hearing from our staff on the safety and security issues, which we're going to hear some more about in tonight's report. A personal thing I wanted to throw out there because I wanted to say thank you to staff at West Middle School. On March 3rd, which was a Saturday, my family and I attended the musical production of Getting to Know the Sound of Music. My son had some parts in that. I just wanted to say thank you to Mr. Goolsby and Mr. Williams and to all the other staff at the building that I know put in a lot of extra time and work very hard on those productions. They really provide outstanding opportunities for our students to learn and to showcase their talents, and it was just a delight. They did such a great job. I know that other buildings have had other productions going on, and I've heard similar good things about those as well. Jessica and I had a meeting with Dr. Lewis while he was in the district last Monday, and we had some further discussions with him about transition planning and board retreat planning. We don't have any concrete proposals to share yet, but we've thrown around some ideas and are kind of getting that to that point. Our board lunch last week was at West Middle School. It was very informative. Thank you to the other board members that attended, Kelly, GR. We had a really informative discussion with student leaders there on a number of issues that they care about, including schedules, use of technology, lockers, and it was really fun to hear from them, kind of their unfiltered responses on a number of things that we covered. Finally, as I mentioned a little bit ago, this past weekend I attended the KASB Board of Directors meeting. Typically we have those in Topeka, but this was at the Basel-Linwood School District. On Friday we had the opportunity to hear about several very interesting initiatives that they have there, including a really extensive mentoring program that uses community volunteers and also high school students who do mentoring of lower grades for credit as part of their education career pathway. And they also had a class come in that was an upper level, one of their advanced business classes in the career pathway, who had started a coffee shop business in the school, and they talked about all of the really cool things that they did as part of that class to start their business and expand. So we also toured a number of their facilities as part of that opportunity. During our business meeting on Saturday, we heard updates on legislative session. The finance study by Dr. Taylor and West Ed, as I mentioned, is due this Friday. The researchers are supposed to be presenting that to legislators next Monday. The content of their report is already being questioned, kind of out there among certain legislators for bias. There's a concern that these particular researchers have been encouraged to justify current levels of spending rather than really look at what might be considered truly adequate. One of the things that'll be really interesting to watch about that, we had a long discussion about this with the advocacy staff, has to do with what outcomes they choose to focus on. Like, how are they measuring success and adequacy, and the different places that those outcomes, so how their report turns out really depends a lot on what choices they make, and it was really unclear from the public sessions that they did a few weeks ago where they were supposed to be kind of explaining all this. It was really unclear what direction they were going to choose. So I would just encourage board members to follow that and see where that lands. There's some interesting and actually positive bills that are being heard this week. One would fix the transportation formula issue that created the stir around Dale Dennis and KSDE and how they were calculating transportation funding. There's a bill that's being heard to fix that, put it in the formula the way that it's been handled, which is good for us. It would be about a $50,000 impact to us if they stopped funding it the way that they have been funding it, is my understanding. Other bills that are being heard today and tomorrow address repeal of the statewide bond cap, which is something that would be positive, as well as addressing some of the equity issues that the court highlighted in the Gannon decision. Bills to restore the teacher due process to state law, and also making some changes to anti-bullying requirements, both passed out of the House recently and have been forwarded onto the Senate. So those are some interesting ones to watch as well. The new governor has announced the creation of a new education council. We had some discussion about this. It's modeled on a commission that was called the P20 Commission that met during the Governor Sebelius administration. It's going to be co-chaired by Randy Watson of KSDE and the CEO of the Board of Regents. The stated purpose of that council is to improve education. It's kind of unclear what their mission is going to be exactly. It's pretty broad. Another item that I wanted to just preview for our board, because we'll be seeing this at our July meeting when we have our organizational items to take care of. We had a discussion as KASB board about our dues structure. It had actually been suspended the last 4 years during block grants. They had held dues flat because the formula that has typically been used kind of increases as your state funding increases. This year, they are planning to go back to using the formula. I think we may see a slight increase in those dues as a result. I didn't see numbers specifically, but I think there were some districts that were going to see increases, some that weren't, depending on how their state funding played out this year. In addition, they're planning to implement a small increase in the legal fund fee, about a $450 increase. I felt pretty comfortable with that because one of the things that we're going to get for that is unlimited access to all of their publications that the legal department does. So right now, if you want one of them, you have to pay for a paper copy. They would now be available to all board members and staff if you're a member of the legal fund. And I think there's about 17 of those publications, so that's a real benefit for us. Of note, the organization has diversified their financials over the years. So it used to be 100% dues funded. Now they have other business through the risk management, insurance, some of those kinds of things, and they've really decreased the amount that they rely on dues for operations, which means that we're getting more out of our dues and not having to fund everything. There's more value added essentially. So it was a very, very positive experience. I like to get to share with all of you what's going on. I think there's a lot of interesting things going on in the legislature, and particularly kind of watching how all of this unfolds around Gannon. Again, just as a reminder, the legislature is supposed to have their response to the court. They're supposed to file briefs by the end of April. So there's a lot of discomfort about how quickly that deadline is coming up and whether they're going to be able to meet it. So that's what I have. So we'll turn it over to Dr. Stubblefield for the superintendent's report.
Good evening. I have a few things. On Wednesday, we expect that some of our students and staff will participate in the National Walkout Plan for 10 a.m. for 17 minutes to honor the victims and survivors of the Parkland, Florida shooting. Wednesday is the 1-month anniversary of that tragedy. We will have additional district administration support at both high schools. Our focus will be to ensure students are safe, supervised, and able to have their voices heard. We respect the rights of all of our students, whether they choose to participate or not. Absences associated with the walkout will be excused. Dr. Anthony Lewis spent the day in the district last Monday visiting several schools and meeting with board officers, LEA officers, and building representatives, and jointly with the Equity Advisory Council as well as Delta. We invite the community to join the board, Dr. Lewis and myself, for our spring community conversation from 6:30 to 8:30 p.m. on April 3rd at the Lawrence Public Library. In addition to following up on topics discussed in the fall, we will get feedback on the high school start time proposal. Dr. Lewis also has accepted invitations to speak to the Lawrence Board of Realtors and Home Builders Association on March 27th and a luncheon hosted by the Chamber on April 10th. The board is approving the selection of learning coach Sunny Halstead, and Sunny's here, as the New York Elementary principal as part of his personnel report tonight. Sunny is well respected for her leadership and success during 14 years as a paraeducator, classroom teacher, athletics coach, curriculum facilitator, and learning coach. It was thrilling to be in the Topeka for the Boys and Girls Clubs of America Youth of the Year competition last Wednesday. Free State Junior Ruth Gothengary is Lauren's fourth state winner in 7 years. She represents us well and will compete next regionally in Dallas. I attended some of the state high school basketball games in Wichita this past weekend. Congratulations to Lawrence High for reaching the state semifinals and Free State for finishing state runner-up. Both teams had great seasons. We're proud to announce that Free State School and Southwest Middle School won the Kansas Scholastic Chess Association State Championships in the K-12 and K-8 divisions this weekend. Congratulations also to Lawrence High for numerous honors in the Kansas Scholastic Press Association Regional Contest. Kansas Arthur Bratt Sneed visited all of our elementary schools last week to talk about the writing and illustrating process. This is a part of the Adventures and Imaginations partnership funded by U.S. Bank. The 5th annual Free State Student Artist Youth Art Month exhibition will be on display through the month of March at La Prima Tasa. Secondary parent-teacher conferences will be held this week. Middle and high school teachers look forward to visiting with parents about student progress. All students will be out of school on Friday due to secondary conference week schedule. We also have an elementary plan day on Friday. Spring break is next week, March 19th through the 23rd. Our district office will be closed on Friday of spring break. And this is just a FYI to board members, we are sending out surveys to schools who have shown interest in Gemini 2. We do know we have interest from several schools. If they reach the 80% threshold, Don will probably be sending a doodle calendar for a short special board meeting because the board would have to, if LEA supports is like all these tiers, the final support would have to come from a vote by the board saying that they can participate in Gemini 2. So the deadline is April 2nd. So I think the survey went out today and they'll turn back around pretty quickly. So it will just be a short special meeting to vote. And if there's another way to vote, we can explore that as well. But that's just an FYI.
That's very exciting news. Thank you. Okay, next up on our agenda, patron commentary. Patron commentary. And we do have a patron commentary this evening. Diane Vina, come on up. And I'll read our audience participation. Policy pursuant to Board Policy BCBI, the USD 497 Board of Education welcomes patron comments and thanks you for taking time to talk to us about our policies and procedures. We set aside this time during our regular meetings to hear from the public. This is your time to share your opinions. However, complaints about specific staff or students will be heard by the board in executive session in order to protect the privacy of the individuals to be discussed. While you are not required to share your contact information, we ask for that information so staff or the board can follow up with any specific concerns you may have. Please limit your comments to 5 minutes, and thank you for being here.
Hi, my name is Diane Vina, and I am with the March for Our Lives Committee within Lawrence here. I'm working with the local chapter of the Moms Demand Action Group and also students to give students support as they plan the Lawrence March for Our Lives in South Park on Saturday, March 24th at 10 a.m. We will be part of more than 700 marches worldwide on that day as conceived by the student survivors of Parkland, Florida. And they want to say enough. The time has come to discuss gun reform. Our event is being planned by area students from a lot of the area high schools, and our students are planning it to be a positive rally and march to spark a needed conversation among the state and federal legislatures. This is not at all an anti-gun protest. In fact, it is not intended to be a protest of any kind. Across the nation, our youth have demanded to be heard and supported. These students have asked the adults in their lives to step up, and they demand change. We are proud of the students of the area high schools, and they are ready to make their voices heard, and we are honored to stand beside them and to amplify their message as their parents, teachers, and community members. We know that they will represent our city magnificently. And I just wanted to pass out a little information about it.
Thank you. I'm very excited that we'll be having our own event here in Lawrence. It's a great opportunity for our students in our community. Thank you very much. Awesome. Thank you. Okay, next on the agenda, board commentary. GR and then Kelly.
Yeah, just a couple things. At some point, I'll learn to do it the way Shannon does and write it down, so I don't sound completely unorganized. But so on February 27th, I got to go to South Middle School project night and a community conversation that they held. So I was a little late to project night, and so the students have been working on various projects around the building, and they had them on display. And then the community conversation was they had 8th graders in the gym, and Dr. Jones did a Q&A with those 8th graders about various situations in the building and the culture of the building, and had the students answer those questions all the way from the name change to bullying to academic to do they feel like they had gotten a good education at South, and then they broke off, and all throughout the building they had pairs of teachers that you could just go and sit down, and they had guiding questions just as an opportunity to get to know staff members. And so my son and I just sat down at a table of a teacher that he knew well and a teacher he didn't know well, and we just talked for 25 minutes and got to know them a little better. And then I had been late, so I didn't get to see project night, and so we ran around a building with no lights on, and he showed me all the projects that I missed. And so it was very well done. I was really glad I got to go. March 5th, I got to attend my first meeting of the Comprehensive Plan Steering Committee, what used to be Horizon 2020. So that was really interesting, a little overwhelming, but really interesting. I'm looking forward to serving on that committee. And then the next night, went back to South as just a straight up band geek parent, and got to see a great band concert with 6th and 7th grade band, which is always fun. So it was good.
Thank you. Kelly?
It is Social Work Month. I bet you guys didn't know that, but it is. And I had an opportunity this morning to talk to Jose Cornejo, who is one of the mental health coordinators here at the district. We have 20 social work staff in the district, and then additionally other social workers that serve in different capacities. And I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge them. They work with our students that have IEPs. They're also working in the general population with students experiencing mental health issues. And as we see an increased conversation around behavioral health and how we approach service to our students and how that helps support their education, Jose made a point that I had not thought of, which is that a lot of our social work staff are also providing support to our teachers as well. And that they have taken on a role both at the building level and additionally providing support for the staff. So thank you to all the social workers out in the district.
Thank you. Any other board members? I know that I saw somewhere this week that this is actually like National Public Schools Week or something like that, March 12th through the 16th. And we celebrate public schools every time we are here. So I'm glad for that, but I just wanted to mention that. Okay.
I had one more.
Jill.
I attended yesterday the talk with Lizzie Velasquez. I don't know if anyone else had a chance to do it. Saw a lot. It was kind of nice that it was on a weekend. We saw lots of kiddos, age range K through 12. So really positive message she had. I think you can probably catch a lot of what she said on YouTube if you didn't get a chance to attend. And I know it was recorded by KPR and will be broadcast on the Sunday night replay. So that's kind of a nice service. So it was really a neat partnership with Read Across Lawrence and KU Libraries. So
Excellent. Thank you. All right. So we will move on to our consent agenda. Consent agenda items are those that are considered routine and are adopted by one motion unless any board member or the superintendent requests that an item be removed. The item or items removed are voted on separately. And I know we have a number of retirements to recognize this evening.
We do. So we have Jean Frankel, who has been in the district 3 years as, at Hillcrest. And then we have Penny Kramer from LHS, who's been with us for 28 years. Carol Whalen from New York, who spent 16 years serving our district. Dennis Burgess, who spent 25 years in our district, most recently at Sunflower. Joyce Anderson from Lawrence High with 14 years of service, and Sanda Kircher, who spent 33 years with us lastly at Broken Arrow. So thank you all for your service to Lawrence Public Schools. And with that, I move the Board of Education adopt the items listed on the consent agenda.
So moved.
Jill, are you seconding? Okay. Hey, just making sure. Excellent. Thank you. Okay, Dawn?
Beeson,
Yes.
Fincher,
Yes.
Gordon Ross,
Yes.
Ingram,
Yes.
Johnson,
Yes.
Jones,
Yes.
and Kimball.
Yes.
Motion passes 7-0.
Thank you. Okay, we'll move on to our report and approval item this evening, our elementary science curriculum purchase and adoption of Mystery Science with Jerry Kimball, our Assistant Superintendent for Leading, Learning, and Technology, Darcy Krause, Director of Elementary School Support, and Ellen Willits, Assistant Director of Learning and Instructional Resources. And those are just all the folks that were listed on the agenda, so you'll do some introductions. Thank you.
It is hooked up and going here. Hey, good evening. I am Darcy Krause, and I am Director of Elementary School Support. But more importantly, tonight I am here with an incredible team of teacher leaders, and I would like to introduce them to you. I have Robin Vilsack, I have Jessica Brown, Kara McNorton, and in the cheering section we have Sunny Halstead, and our principal rep is Nancy DeGarmo. This year, I had the privilege of leading a really dedicated team of teachers through the resource adoption process for elementary science. And when we joined as a group, it became very important to us that our process was steeped in these 3 tenets, which was credibility, transparency, and trust. And although tonight we are just going to offer you a brief synopsis of our journey and our subsequent recommendation, please know that we did create a s'more which chronicles our entire journey, provides a repository of information that we can share with any and all stakeholders. And to that end, in your board enclosure, you will find a link that will give you access not only to this s'more, but also to the Mystery Science website itself so that you can explore.
So before we could begin our search for a new science curriculum, we had to kind of fill the gap and insert a bridge resource, which was Mystery Science, just to give teachers and students something to work with because we needed science in our schools. And so we embedded professional development not only on the next generation science standards at the beginning of the year, but also Mystery Science, how to use it. And we provided teachers with kits so that they could perform the mysteries, which you would think of as the experiments. The science leadership team was comprised of not only grade level representatives, but elementary learning coaches, special education representatives, equity representatives, principal representatives, and district representatives. And so it was a lot of great minds in one room. And our process kind of took hold with determining the needs of our district and that criteria. And so from there, we started to research all the viable resources that are out there that are published and created. And we reviewed our curriculum rubric that the district uses just to make sure that any resource we were looking at was also hitting the equity lens that we needed it to. In the end, we kind of started off with the 6 that we felt were the best. So we vetted 6. That took 5 months to kind of go through the rubrics ourselves. We provided the rubrics to the companies as well so they could give their input. And when we dug through those, we came up with what we felt was like the top 3. And so we took those 3 and we invited those companies to come speak to our leadership team. And they all did, and it was fantastic to hear kind of their points and views and what they felt like we should know that we might not already. And then the team finally met and we discussed pros and cons of each resource. And from there, a private link was sent out to the group and it ran away. Mystery science was the one that most people felt like met kind of the general things we needed to meet. It got 95% of our vote, and we're going to tell you a little bit about why.
So we determined that mystery science has a lot of pros. Students are highly engaged with this. That's from teacher reports across the district at our elementary schools. It's got a great ability to engage with parents. We can email them a synopsis of the mystery and the standards that they're working on. It's NGSS aligned, with it having a direct link to the disciplinary core ideas, the science and engineering practices, and the cross-cutting concepts. Those are directly linked to all the performance standards. It's current. It's so current. We loved that it's not going to go out of date. A lot of the resources that we look at, when you get the print, they're going to go out of date the second the book's printed. And this one, real time. They're constantly updating it. I call it a living, breathing document. So I think that's pretty cool. And it has learner access for everybody, our ELL students and our SPED students. And we had people on our team that looked at it from that lens. They have high-quality lessons. These lessons were created by teachers that have a passion for science. There's online support. You can get support 24 hours a day, 7 days a week through them. And we couldn't find that with any other company. And that's not at any additional cost to us. They're continually upgrading. They make known what's coming forward. And they make sure that they're going to be, we started with it as a supplement to augment Tier 1 instruction, but it's so robust now. It has so much in there that we think that we can use it as a standalone core resource. It's very easy for teachers to use. They can access it, follow through with it, and it doesn't matter whether they're comfortable and confident in teaching science or a little leery about science. It's convenient for everybody. All grade levels get to be on board right now. And we found that to be very important because some of them, the resources we didn't think could. So we were super excited about that. It's ready to go. There's no huge learning curve. You get on and you're pretty well ready to go. The professional development is going to be minimal. And a lot of our teachers have already been in it this year. So that's extremely helpful. They tie in current events with Mystery Doug, and we get additional mysteries and experiments weekly that explain phenomenon-based questions that are submitted by students all across the country. The kits are available for us. They take mostly household items that we feel can help the teachers and will be inclusive for the year. There are a few items which might be perishable and must be provided by the teachers, but they're noted on the inventory sheets, which include with each kit. And we created and sent out the kits based on that premise this fall and haven't received any complaints about it so far. So that's a pretty big deal that those kits are working. And then they have technical text tied into all of their mysteries through readworks.org and gatepick.com.
So we know that there's no perfect resource out there for our kiddos. And after multiple discussions, we did identify a few challenges, and so we wanted you to be aware of those. And also just to show you our reflection within this process. To date, Mystery Science lacks 3 performance standards. These are anticipated to be on board by next school year for the 2018-2019 school year, but they are missing right now. But in talking with them, they're aware of that and are working really hard to get us those. We feel confident that them telling us that they'll be on board with it, we feel confident with this because every promise so far that Mystery Science has made has come to, they have followed through with. And so we feel really confident with that. This year, they already added 20 additional mysteries just within this year, and that really is one of the great benefits of utilizing an online resource because it will be updated in real time. We will provide lesson supports for those teachers that are in grade 2 and 5 to supplement those 3 standards. There is 1 in 2nd grade, and there are 2 in the 5th grade missing, so we will supplement those until they can become available through Mystery Science. Another concern or challenge for us is that Mystery Science is an online resource, and we all know the challenges that sometimes can come with technology. And the unpredictability of it. Some teachers may view as not having a text as that traditional text, not having that traditional text could be a little challenging for them, but so far within all of the, what would you call that? The usage. Yeah, the usage, we haven't had any complaints about that at all. The Mystery Science lessons are structured to engage and teach the NGSS standards in a typical elementary classroom. And so for those students and teachers wanting to delve deeper into concepts, there may be some additional research that they'll need to follow through with. So our recommendation is, as you can see, that Mystery Science addresses the needs of all of our students and has garnered the support of our teachers. And so for all of this and all the reasons we've shared previously, we would recommend to the board the adoption of Mystery Science as our primary resource for grades K through 5 for next year.
Questions? Melissa?
Sorry, how many teachers have piloted the program, and then across what schools?
Well, actually, it was really nice because, as we mentioned, we put it in place as a bridge resource. So actually, every single teacher in every single school has actually done an informal pilot of it this year.
I was going to ask in reading through the board enclosure, and I think it was this morning that I was on looking through some of the notes. Did I read correctly, because it was really late last night, that in some instances did teachers actually take the Mystery Science and start to use it for their core curriculum? Did I actually read that correctly?
Yes, and I can speak to that as a building principal. We were kind of in flux for a few years with our science resources, and as a principal, I was concerned that we weren't teaching the standards. And through some of my walkthroughs, I noticed online, and my teachers were talking about this thing called Mystery Science. And when I investigated it a little bit further, I found that they could get it free, actually, for, I believe it was 60 days. So they were creating multiple email accounts so that they could continue to teach it. Teachers are resourceful, and we were. But what I saw that made my heart happy was that we were teaching science. And I really hadn't seen a prolific interest in that prior to that. And I understand that we just had a few hiccups getting started. But what I did see was the excitement and the engagement, even in my teachers that kind of looked at science and went, oh. It is that open and go resource that's right there and available.
So I am not at all uncomfortable with the idea of having online resources, but I can you help me understand how having an online resource instead of a text would impact a student in one of these classes. So, like right now, I don't think that my kiddo is using a science textbook in fourth grade, for example.
Right.
So, does it really change the experience that the student is having?
One of the things that I became concerned about, because reading is my heart and my love, and knowing Common Core and the high standards and the rigor that we have, is I was really concerned about the technical text part. And so one of the things in visiting with these folks, and they're so accessible, is they too were concerned and have partnered with some of the two websites that were mentioned in the presentation, and they're free. They're community property out there, and those provide and link into all of the standards. So our kids can not only view the video, which is kind of the phenomena, the hook, the anchor standard that's underlies the entire mystery, but they can also explore it via connected text through those websites.
Okay. Do we have a level of comfort that we've reached a point now with our devices in our elementary classrooms that it's going to support well that aspect of using a digital curriculum for this?
Yes, because many times this is a whole group. Actually, in elementary, most of the time,
Is whole group. So up on the screen, the teacher might be showing text and having the kids read it.
Exactly. And one of the things that also was very encouraging to me is I've done a lot of these text adoptions, and seldom do our ELL and our SPED representatives ever land where we do on the same resource for accessibility reasons. And in this case, they were out front of the line cheering all the way because of the accessibility and availability to their special populations.
Okay.
I've also seen it utilized for reteaching. You know, you can run this as many times as you need, or if a special education student needs to be pulled from the class for any reason, they can have the exact same lesson in a separate setting.
Okay, thank you. Kelly?
This is just more of a procedure question. I was really excited to see this, and thank you for all the work you've done.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah. Married to a chemist, he was excited to see it too. So my question is around curriculum review. So are you all elementary teachers? Yes. So have middle school teachers been at all, just thinking about how one of the things that was described to me when you do curriculum reviews, you look at it from bottom up or up down, and I'm wondering how middle school teachers who also in my conversations with teachers, because I'm married to a science, talk to me about some deficits in that curriculum as well. So I'm wondering where we're at with that and how this connects.
Well, I can't exactly speak to where middle school science is with their adoption process. However, it was imperative to me that we did have some vertical alignment lenses on this as we were looking at it for adoption. And so Sunny has served many purposes. She was a learning coach on there, but she was also a science teacher, and I'll let her speak to that vertical alignment piece.
So the last few years we've worked with secondary to align 6th, 7th, 8th to the high school. And right now they are open ed resources, and they've built all of their course masters in Blackboard. And so all of those teachers have access to that. And they hopefully will cross over to Power School, and we will still have that. This has been a lot of work, so I think it's going to work. But yes, the resource talk has been out there for a long time. I do know we've run into a lot of kind of roadblocks because NGSS is so new. There aren't a lot of resources that truly are aligned. And so it was not, the want to jump into something and spend hundreds of thousands of dollars that really wasn't aligned. So I do know the teachers are asking for that. I don't know where they are in the process now, but that's definitely, when I was the curriculum facilitator last year for secondary, we worked to get that vertical alignment of those standards for students. Does that answer your question?
No. I think it did, but I think it's because I'm I'm a community representative asking these questions. So the middle school teachers were really not engaged too much in this process when you all were deciding. And when we look at curriculum review, we'll pick subjects based on priorities that have been identified. So it could be a while before we're aligning science.
Actually, and when we were actually doing that report on April 26th, but one of the conversations we had last week was the state is in the process of reevaluating standards. So we have decided our process will be a year behind the state. So they just finished language arts. That way we're not ahead of them and then have to go back and redo it. I don't know where they are exactly, but that made the most sense for us as we look at reviewing our curriculum, because we don't want to be ahead of them, because then we'll have to change it. So I think ELA and something else went this year, Jerry? ELA and math were this year, so it would make sense for us to start there, because then we can align our curriculum to the new state standards. Okay. So that's how we'll create our process going forward.
Okay, and as a board, when we're making decisions about curriculum in the meantime, it could be several years before you're looking at science. I mean, obviously we need to.
No, I think the state will then pick up science or social studies, so it'll be next year, okay. And then we'll be a year behind. So it won't be years out, because they're realigning all of them in the next couple of years.
Okay, so we won't be looking at them my understanding was that it was every year you looked at one particular content area, you looked at another content area, and then you got 7 years through and you were starting all over again. But
no, so when, and I'm talking high level because they just brought me up to speed last week. When we looked at our new process, will provide an opportunity, not necessarily go in depth, but to look at the end of the year, what worked, what didn't work. And we're really working to create a process where you're looking at things each year, but it may not be as intense for each content area. Darcy, I'm looking at you. Am I saying that right?
Part of our curriculum review process is where we are going to revise during the summer and implement during the year. And we are creating a systemic process by which all of the different content areas will be evaluated, or at least have eyes on each year, and it will provide a feedback loop for our teachers. So during the school year, the academic year, they will provide us feedback based on guiding documents and things that we have put out. And then during the summer, when we have our curriculum teams in for that heavy duty work, then that's when we will revise based on their input and any revisions which have occurred.
Okay. I was concerned we were going to be doing this kind of piecemeal, where now we're at elementary and a few years later we'll be at this middle school. And then I just wanted to make sure that we were all working together as one team, and that sounds like you've addressed that and been thinking about that, and I appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay. Other questions for the team? This is great. Thank you for all the work that you've put into this. I'm really excited about this. We are ready for a motion if someone would like to make the motion.
Sure. I move that the Board of Education approve the adoption and purchase of a 2-year K-5 membership to Mystery Science in the amount of $27,972 for implementation beginning in the 2018-2019 school year.
Second.
Fincher? Aye. Gordon Ross?
Yes.
Ingram?
Yes.
Johnson?
Yes.
Jones?
Yes.
Kimball?
Yes.
Beeson?
Yes.
Motion passes 7-0.
Thank you very much. And I just wanted to say welcome and congratulations to Sunny on your new position at New York Elementary School. We're excited for you. Thank you. Okay. Last item this evening, a report on safety and security district-wide with Tony Barron, Executive Director of Facilities and Operations, and Ron May, Director of Operations.
That's okay. I'll see if I can figure it out.
I guess this is not the very last thing. We actually have an executive session. I'm sorry, I misspoke. We have an executive session slated for after we've had a chance to hear this report.
Well, good evening. Tony Barron, Executive Director of Facilities and Operations. I just wanted to take time today to give you an update on where we're at with our current policies and procedures for safety and security, and also just the unfortunate reality we're in today's world. Unfortunate that we're here making this a high priority, but that's the reality we're in right now. So we want to make sure we do the best we can to provide the best resources to our students and staff. So to start off with, I just want to give a quick update. I'm going to give the majority of the report today. Ron May, the Director of Operations, is also going to give you some feedback, or excuse me, give you some information on some of the policies and procedures we currently have in place and kind of how we got to the point we are today. In 2013, Ron and several district employees went to a FEMA-sponsored training in Maryland where they stayed on site for a week and brought back some very valuable information. At the same time, we passed the 2013 bond issue where we also added some of our physical features that helped out with our secured entries. We've added classroom locks, and we've also added some more security cameras. So the focal point for me today is going to be more of talking about where we're going to go from today moving forward. But I'm going to ask Ron to come up and kind of give you a snapshot of where we've been to get where we are today, and then I'll come back up and go over some of the items here on this list. One thing I do want, before I step back, one thing I do want to make sure that we all are aware of here is that if you, at the top, it does say this is planning and considerations. So we've just been doing a lot of brainstorming lately, and we're throwing a lot of stuff out there. And the reason we wanted to get it in front of you so you could help us to guide us. We can never do enough, to be honest with you. And so we need to find that right balance, what you feel comfortable with and what we can provide. So I'll ask Ron to come up and speak some more.
Good evening, Ron May, Director of Operations. Like Tony said, a lot of this started back in 2013 when we took the group of employees and first responders and other people from the area that we work with to get some training on how to write an effective emergency operations plan. At that time, we came back. We spent the year revising. We have flip charts that have different, whether it's tornado drill, active shooter, those kinds of things that are within that flip book, and we revised and retooled those steps. So those are some things that we did for best practices at that point. Obviously, we're coming up on some, there's been some newer things that have come up that Tony will talk about training-wise that we can give some new tools to teachers and to administrators to maybe make them feel a little bit more at ease about what they might do in the event of an intruder in their building. I'd also like to add, so with that flip book and with sometimes some buildings, they just need a little bit of clarification on some things. I've been meeting with all of the building principals. As of today, I believe I have 5 or 6 buildings left to visit that they'll be done by the end of this week. We're giving them an opportunity to give me any feedback on any concerns or clarifications they need specific to the book. If there's any physical or special issues that we need to deal with on the short term and the long term in their buildings, we've worked on that a little bit as well. And then at the elementary level, one of the focuses that we've made very quickly was to move Boys and Girls Club to secure entrances. Because even though it is a group that's leasing and using our building space, there are kids, and it's kind of an extension of the day, so we want to make sure that people feel at ease with that as well. So we've been working through how that looks in each building, so the Boys and Girls Club are utilizing the security. Just as an example, some of those systems they were setting up, say, inside the secured entrance, and still buzzing people through, but if you have somebody sitting there with a badge that can open the door, they can be easily, somebody without a weapon could take that badge away and still get some of the reasons why we did that. What else do you want me to touch on? Okay. Yeah, the Boys and Girls Club. Are there any questions concerning any of that at this time?
As you've been visiting the buildings, have you found any any common themes as you've gone through or anything like that?
That's a good question. Not any, there hasn't been a glaring, this is just absolutely not working. I think The largest concern, which we will talk about with some of the potential training coming up with Alice or the avoid and deny defend, is the big question from teachers is, making sure there's clarification when it's okay. We have what's called a shelter in place. And that's basically what we tell them to do, but now we're adding into that, when is it appropriate to run, to get away, that kind of thing. So that's been a consistent question. And then questions concerning the physical part, we have a lot of glass, a lot of windows, a lot of open learning spaces, and those are specific to each building. And so just helping them walk through those plans of what that should look like. Those are probably the two big things.
Thank you, Ron.
Yeah, GR, that's a great question. There are many strengths and challenges to what we've done in 2013 with the secured entries and also making the classrooms transparent, because that's what we wanted. We built learning pockets so kids could go outside of the classroom and still be somewhat monitored. So we've added glass into our classrooms. But like I said, at the same time, the whole goal is to keep somebody out of the building through the secured entry. One of our challenges, and in my opinion, over the past several years, has been trying to operate out of 3 different departments. At one point, Ron was in administrative services, us in facilities and operations, and we run some of our badge access and our security out of technology. So we've been trying to bring those all together. Ron and I obviously work together now, and I've been working with Jerry Kimball on what the security part of it looks like in the badge access. I think for us to be at the table on a weekly basis to be able to talk about how we operate and how we manage and how we badge systems in. Technology is great and awesome, but we can really overthink things. There's so many things that we can program in a door. Some schools, when we first started, we were hitting our badge reader and both doors were coming open. And sometimes they get tied into the accessible button. When does the accessible button open? Because it negates the secured entry, but at the same time, somebody has to be able to get in the door. So there's a lot of behind-the-scenes programming that we've learned a lot over the past 3 years on how to operate and how to function. So we're coming together. We feel like we're communicating better. We're getting on the same page. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to go down the list here. I apologize for the fragmented list, but it's just kind of like I said, it's been a brainstorm. So a few weeks ago, we sat down with Lawrence Police Department. They brought several representatives to the table with us, as well as SROs and high school staff, high school principals, to talk about some of the things going on currently, some of the things we're doing, and some of the things that how we can move forward. We spent 2 hours sitting around the table. Ron was also involved in that, and so we talked about the importance of getting together, as a big group every so often, and collaborating with them and using their best practices, and them knowing our schools and them knowing how we operate in the systems that we're going to put in place. So that was a very good meeting just to start off on, let's expand this conversation. Moving down the additional campus security and services and measures, we understand there at Lawrence High and Free State, we have students leaving the building during the day and going to other buildings. It would be the outdoor athletic facility at Free State. They're moving to and from. And at Lawrence High, as you know, having 3 buildings, they're constantly on the move between every period. So we've talked about whether we expand our security staff or we hire a contracted third party to get us to the end of the year to at least have a presence there to be able to monitor and see, just kind of a deterrent more than anything, and to be able to alert if somebody suspicious was around. So that's something that we're looking into for a short term right now. And then we talked about our night activities. When does our building, when do we unlock the doors, and when do we say, okay, this is no longer a secured campus? Our high schools we're always 18 hours a day. I mean, we're in and out. And so at what point do we just open the doors and start letting people in and out? That's definitely a conversation that we're going to have. I'm not saying that they need to be monitored 18 hours a day, but that's something we're going to ask and say, how comfortable do we feel with leaving the buildings open and just letting anybody come in without somebody monitoring that open door? So that's another conversation we'll have. And stop me at any time, please, if you have questions. Additional facilities and operations staffing, as I mentioned before, we added the secured entries. At the same time, we added 682 programmable locks in our elementary and middle schools, which just provided a lot of work for us. They are great. They have the potential to be really good locks if we can get to them and program them correctly. With these particular programmable locks, we physically have to download a program into a handheld device and plug in to every single device. So if we want to change a program, we have to write the program, go out and plug into it. At the same time, these are new locks, and so we're learning a lot about them and how they operate. I think one of the challenges for us is we have probably have not done as good of a job as we should have as teaching our teachers how to monitor when a flashing light comes on, means dead battery, how to operate the remote fob. It has a remote fob that you stand back, you hold for 2 seconds, and it'll put the lock, automatically lock the door. Now, granted, that's if the door's closed. It will not shut the door. The door has to physically be closed also. So if the door's shut, you can push the button and it'll lock down the door. But that all just takes a lot of work and a lot of upkeep, a lot of preventative maintenance. They run off batteries. And so that's another thing that we have to continue to monitor is how many cycles can this go through before batteries need to be changed. Couple things like that we're really needing additional staff. As far as the safety and security technician, also you see that we need people in the field to go out and monitor and maintain what we currently have. And then also at the bottom, we've talked about a supervisor of school safety. So who is that person that's going to be the communicator with the principal? We have 3 other supervisors in our department right now, and they are the ones who are starting to take over a lot of the communication with our principals to go out and say, okay, this is what I see. The principal will share what they see. This is what needs to get done. Trying to put the people who are doing the work in direct contact with our principals so they can get that work done a little bit quicker than coming through myself or Ron. Also, with this school safety supervisor of school safety, Anna had mentioned it, or excuse me, Dr. Stubblefield had mentioned it earlier, that we also have fire systems, security alarms that also need attention. 4 years ago, we used to have our fire inspections by our local fire department, and they did a good job coming in and inspecting us. Over the past 4 years, we've had 4 different inspectors from the Kansas State Fire Marshal. They typically come in and really are a lot more strict with the policies and procedures of the Kansas State Fire Marshal. Now, granted, it's a good benefit, but I can tell you that it probably ties up about 3 months of our time from a technician standpoint. We physically have to have somebody walk the spaces with him. On top of that, we got to come back. We have the write-ups. We have write-ups every year at every school. I think Lawrence High one year, we had several on just doors, fire doors not shutting. And it sounds so simple and easy. We fix them. A solid wood door swells. So depending on the humidity when a fire marshal comes in, really, whether it's going to shut or not, there's just a lot of factors to consider, but we have to go pay attention to that. We have 90 days to correct those. If not, we have to write waivers, and we have to write a 6-month waiver, and that just creates a lot of work for us to become compliant. And the teachers have really done well on adapting to those policies. So we're getting better every year, but that just means more monitoring for our fire alarm systems and somebody to go around and say, hey, you shouldn't be doing that. That's against the Kansas State Fire Marshal, and just somebody to be that voice.
I have a couple questions.
Okay.
One is about the locks. So, because that has come up, I mean, we have heard a lot from teachers whose doors were not working. Mm-hmm. And I am hearing at various site council meetings, those things are being fixed. But I guess one was brought up at Liberty Memorial Central the other day, kind of this notion of, were these locks really a good idea? And as we kind of think about remodeling Lawrence High and even sort of the work we're doing at Free State, do we continue down this road with these locks, or are we rethinking that? Or can you talk a little bit about what makes these locks the better locks we want to use,
right,
versus just having a deadbolt inside a teacher could lock or whatever?
Right.
And then the other question I have, kind of about the supervisor for school safety, so it's 2 totally separate questions, sorry.
That's okay.
So my understanding is that in the past, before last year, Ron, you were handling a lot of that with our buildings. And so I guess I just need a little clarification on why we aren't going back to that model versus hiring somebody new. Kind of just a little bit about maybe just job description changes so that there's a better understanding why we would invest that money when we have somebody who's trained and trusted in our district to do that work already.
Yeah, sure. Let me answer the first question,
okay,
and then I'll come back to the second. The 220s, I think that'd be a good conversation to enter into. CO220, I'm sorry. It's called the CO220.
That's the lock.
Programmable lock,
okay.
Yes. I think you're right. I think it's something that when we first started the bond construction, we we sat down and tried to have as fair of an evaluation of it as we could and tried to get to know it the best we could. It was somewhat new on the market. Is it the right lock? I don't know. You bring up a great point. Walking up and turning a thumb turn is also not a bad option either. It just depends on whether we want to check out keys. That's one thing that we get away from. They are programmable, so the teachers do have a code that they enter to get in and out of their space. And also, I don't have one on here, but they have a little proxy card that you can go wave in front of the door that will allow you access. And if you're a teacher, you can wear the little proxy card on your badge and get in and out. There's some good functions to it, very programmable. We can program them to lock at certain times a day. So, for instance, if we have school from 7 to 10 or 7 to 7, and at 7 p.m., we want it just automatically go to lock. It has an internal clock that will automatically lock it, and there's some great functions there. On the back end of that, when you have evening programs, and you're asking our general public to come in to the school, now you have a door that you have to punch a code in every time to get in, and so that's the downside to it. And so Jessica, I could list both probably pros and cons. I'd probably come up with a pretty equal list to both of those. The fobs that we have that lock them, they have been somewhat challenging right now. We're in the process of replacing all of our one-button fobs with a two-button fob, which is a lot easier. It just works better for whatever reason. So I can't, to be honest with you, I'm not going to defend it or trash it. I think it's a good discussion, if that makes sense.
If I could interject, we actually had a fairly substantial conversation about locks when we had the chief of the fire department as a board member. And there was a real concern about deadbolts because, yes, they're easy, but it's also easy for a student to lock a teacher out. And so, that was the concern that was expressed at that time. And so, obviously that would not be a good situation. So I can't comment on, whether these are the best thing out there. But I think people felt pretty strongly that the deadbolt was not a very good. Ron, you were here. Does that ring a bell?
Yeah, there were quite a few things. Where it all sparked from was teachers saying, if I go into a lockdown and I'm clear across the room, I have to go all the way across my room, I have to go out in the hallway, I have to lock the door, because you run into a couple of issues. One, by code, we're supposed to keep doors shut. Well, especially as you get into the higher secondary levels, but at all levels, kids are coming and going, especially now with flex spaces and things like that. So kids coming and going, doors locked or unlocked, that was where we started with fob. So that was the first thing that really drew us to the fob, was because a teacher could potentially lock their door from 40 feet away, as long as they have the fob on them. So that is a very good question, and I know that as we look at the high schools, we will revisit, is that the best one, or should we just look at being able to lock the door from the inside? There's a lot of other options we can look at, that if we think the CO220s are not doing the trick for us. I think something that you didn't bring up, at the middle school level specifically, we had some issues with actual contractors, and the installation wasn't done correctly on some of those, unfortunately. We're working through that as well.
So I think this is something that GR and I will continue to ask questions about as we move through planning for the secondary bond issue. As we get those, we will have times where we talk about things like finishes and fixtures, and as we move forward with those projects. So the other thing I remember coming up in the conversation when we chose these the last time had to do with something you mentioned, which was the keys. And we did have some security concerns because we had keyed doors, and the keys were leaving the district with former employees, and we were never getting them back. And so one of the benefits, and I think Tony expressed it well, that there's pros and cons to what we chose, but one of the benefits was that we could more easily reprogram a lock if we had that circumstance arise. So I think we just, as facility committee members, we need to take that feedback and continue to ask questions about it.
I think too, one of the things that we had also talked about in the last facilities committee meeting, that Tony had found as he's working through the reports of these locks, is that he's not finding, correct me if I'm wrong, but he's not finding one single common thread about why the complaints are coming. It's contractors put them in wrong. It's the lack of training with the teacher because they don't know that the battery's going bad. It's the fobs need to be replaced. It's multiple issues, and so they're trying to correct them all. So you can't right now. They can't isolate it to the lock is bad because there's so many other external factors that are fixable that they're working through to try to fix them. Is that probably a good way to say that?
Yeah, that's very accurate. Okay. And like I said, we've learned a lot about them over the last 3 years. I'm trying not to be partial one way or the other. I'm trying to get a fair.
Yeah, and I'm not trying to advocate for one or the other.
Right.
I'm just telling you what I've heard anecdotally from teachers in the past couple months with the lockdowns at Cordley and Deerfield, and then the recent sort of, just kind of overall stress. And so everybody's checking their locks. Right.
Yep.
And they're not working for
right.
one reason or another. And so if you just continue to sort of think about it as we move forward.
Yeah, I think it's worth it. It's definitely worth the discussion. So, yeah, we, GR, appreciate you bringing that up. My staff would tell me that they believe in the lock. They think they think exactly what you said. They feel like if we can get the right training out there, get the right information to the right people, that we can make this happen. So yeah, which kind of leads into the next statement, and I'll let Dr. Stubblefield help me with this, is the supervisor of school safety. Now there's things with Ron's role. First of all, let me back up. We all, as you know, only have a dedicated amount of time in our day that we try to do things. Ron has several items on his list of things to do in several areas. And so, he meets with, he does some work with athletics. He does some works with some truancy stuff, and he's in charge of the safety and security. So we talk about, okay, what is a priority and how do we get to where we need to go? As I've been into this the past probably 5 to 6 weeks, I've been pretty deep into it. I'm realizing that it is a lot of work. And part of it is the education part of it, for somebody to be out in the field visiting with the people and having the time without having to be at meetings, without having to be at the traffic commission, without having to be on the boundary committee, without all the things that are in Ron's job that would help this out. So I know there's some consideration to that. Dr. Stubblefield, do you have anything to add to that, or just kind of along the lines of, hey, we understand there's a lot on our plates, Ron and I share a lot, and we just want somebody to have that as their main focal point. And if we're going to, as I go down the list also, you also notice that if we're going to have more security at the high school, if we're going to have more security if the middle school ends up adding more security, who's in charge of that? Who's going to train him? Who's going to teach him how to do all the things we're going to do is where the school safety supervisor kind of comes into play. So I'm not sure if that answers your question or if it gives you a little bit more information to think about or not.
Are we being asked to approve that hire tonight? Or is this just
No, that's on the list. That's one of the ones that depended on funding, because we weren't planning, it was for next year. So that's one that was on the list that has come up at different conversations, but.
So I guess rather than spending too much more time talking about it, I would just ask that when it comes back, that it's a little more fleshed out and we have a little better understanding of kind of what's going on with all the positions in your office, so that it makes a little more sense to us as we approve a new position.
Sure, yeah. It'll be a March 15th submittal.
Great.
So, Tony, I can follow up with you, but I think, and Jessica, I want to speak for you, flushing out yours, Ron's, that whole thing, so that they have a better understanding of all the different things that are happening.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, Jill.
A question. I assume directed to Facilities Committee, we're still at a point maybe where we can have the architects or review the plans for Free State and Lawrence High to see if there's anything besides locks I mean, whether there's design changes, or is that something that we're at our max budget, but I mean, this is an opportunity to kind of overlook the whole
We're
design.
probably at a place where we can do a little more of that with Lawrence High than we can at Free State. I think we're at 50% construction documents with Free State. Tony, does that sound right? I think that's
down the road.
Yeah, we're pretty far down the road because I think we're planning to start construction this summer.
Right.
But it is certainly worth asking the question whether, as even on that project, if there are things we should revisit. I just don't know. I don't know if we'll have a greater opportunity to work those into the fabric of the plan on the front end with Lawrence High, is what I'm trying to say. And
We should certainly review them.
absolutely,
I don't know if the architects have that expertise to look through that specific lens, but it seems like there's a lot of other issues to address besides, in addition to locks, but.
Right. I think that the team that we're working with would be able to bring that expertise to the table to answer that question. Right. And that's, I mean, that you're right. That's the balance, right? Tony mentioned that we put a lot of glass into our buildings, and I continue to believe that educationally is the right thing to do. So it's that balance between meeting our needs educationally and what are the resources that we have to put in place to wrap that in a safe envelope, I guess, more than anything. So we'll make a point of putting this on our next facility agenda to talk about Free State in particular, and that aspect of it, and report back.
So I'm going to move on to additional professional development. One thing that we had talked about is on the emergency operations plan team, and we're going to bring that back together, and it's going to become somewhat more active. And we're going to attend what is called the ALICE training, ALERT, and it's an acronym for Alert, Lockdown, Inform, Counter, Evacuate, in March, and where a handful of us will become certified instructors. And this is kind of let's get to it in March and see if that's the right thing for USD 497. Come back and put the team together and see if that's the way we want to move. We can go to it. It's a 2-day training, and maybe decide that maybe that's not where we want to go, and start to explore other options. But I think it's worth the upfront money to start to look into those to see what type of format we would want to go down, or what type of format we want to choose for a more, I guess, more in-depth policy and procedure that we can adopt. So that's what we're going to do March 20th. Also, in the meantime, we're going to have Lawrence Police Department come, and they have their own PowerPoint of intruder training that they're going to share with our administrative PDs. So all of our administrators will be here, so they can kind of get a taste of some more information coming straight from the PD, and at least start the conversation and get their minds thinking about the any more in-depth policies and procedures also. So that'll happen on March 15th. Also, one of the SROs had mentioned that there's a summer training seminar. It's called the briefings, and it really brings law enforcement administration together to talk. It's more of a, hey, let's all come together and talk about how we can improve what's worked well, what hasn't worked well. And the SRO who went last year was really spoke very highly of it, and so have just started to look into that. I don't have a lot of information on it yet, but we're going to continue to explore what that looks like also. As I mentioned in the previous statement, reassemble the emergency operations plan team. We hope to meet 4 to 6 times a year, and I'm just going to go straight down to the team members here. If you look on district administration, building administration, we'll have a representative from each level. And then first student, Lawrence Police Department, we still need to reach out to Fire Med, Lawrence Fire Med, and Douglas County Emergency Management, but I know Ron has contacts there that he can reach out to, and I know they'll be more than willing to join. Ron also had mentioned before that a handful of our schools were not, for Boys and Girls Club, which is an after-school program, they just were not utilizing the secured entry, and so we're going to move them. We've moved them effective today into the secured entry, and we're going to, we know there's some physical challenges as far as space with our admin assistants and overlap that we're going to have to deal with. So we've asked our principals to make that change, and then we'll get feedback. And physically, if we have to make some physical changes this summer, they'll have to be very minor, but I know there's some areas where we can make a physical change to make it a lot easier transition for everybody. So we're in the process of doing that. We want to consider them as our same as what we do before 3 o'clock. You know, they're the same kids that are in the schools, so we want to treat them with the same security measures. And at the same time, that means that's more additional training for Boys and Girls Club, and for them to, I've met with them twice already, and they will adopt the same in-depth policy and procedures that we do, so we're both on the same page when it comes to anything that may happen, and so the kids will be familiar with it also. We've also talked about in some of those areas where we do have a lot of transparency is trying to find a nice happy medium on how do we give a place for somebody to hide or somebody to go, or to not have a straight look at somebody. And we talk about some of that one-way film. There's a one-way film that you can put on some glass, and it'd be in certain areas, and this is definitely a case-by-case basis that we're looking into this. Also add security cameras and have a maintenance plan just to help our security camera technicians to stay on top of them and to make sure we're operational. And at the same time, and this is mentioned in the next point here, is how do we utilize those security cameras as you walk into a building and you see yourself on TV. Sometimes it makes a big difference of what you do if there's going to be security cameras everywhere, and if we have somebody actively monitoring the security cameras, whether it's in an office somewhere or whether it's the admin assistant has a separate screen right next to her that has just a flip of the security footage that she can go to certain places just to look. Now, granted, I know they have plenty to do, but it's there so that when people walk in, they know that they're being, if somebody is considering doing something, that at least they know that they're being watched. District-wide communication system. For our department, we, when cell phones came out, I remember they were the greatest thing ever. You didn't have to carry that heavy two-way radio on your hip anymore. What I've noticed over the past several years is it's really become a hindrance for communication. One of the great things about carrying a two-way radio is when somebody makes an announcement, whether it pertains to me or not, I hear it, and I have an idea what's happening in the workforce, what's happening in the district. Wherever I'm working, I'm on the same channel. So I know in the back of my mind, I'm passively listening to that. Right now, we have cell phones, and it's just a one-way communication, and a lot of times our staff is not getting the right information. So we were looking at possibly looking into a two-way radio system for our maintenance staff. And as we looked into that last fall, I think it's important that we try to expand that into providing two-way radios at our schools that will communicate directly with the district and communicate directly district-wide, or communicate with everyone district-wide, whoever has a handheld radio. A couple reasons for that. I think of a natural disaster. A natural disaster, cell phones go down, we lose all communication. If our phone systems are down or switches are down, we cannot communicate. Even if we had an unfortunate event in our schools, I know our phones, everybody's phones would be really bogging down the cell phone towers, and then the ability to have something in your hand that you can communicate directly to, whether it's district office, whether it's our facility and operations team, that you can make a call and everybody would know exactly what's going on. We change frequencies, everybody's on the same frequency. And in our ultimate world, we would somehow find a way to connect those two ways into our LPD and fire med systems if they would be willing to even consider that. Now we have a direct route, so that's something we're going to look into. It's a very extensive plan. It's something that I think we can start slow and start to build to a certain point. It's not something that we're going to expect we're going to go purchase this summer and have it all in place. But I think we can slowly have a plan, a 5-year plan or a 3-year plan to get where we can really have a lot better communication than what we currently have.
So is the plan to have maintenance staff and office staff to have these, or to have every teacher in the building have a two-way radio?
No, I wouldn't say every teacher. I would say I would probably be more along the lines of our teachers have, they do have the phones they can communicate with, which is a landline. We have the overhead intercom. This would be more for a district, the principals. Typically, principals, custodians, and security carry them around right now. Maybe a handful of teachers have some. I'm not really familiar with how many buildings where the teachers do have them.
So how would this be different then from what we're already doing?
We don't carry two-way radios.
You don't carry them, but your custodial staff does, and
it's only isolated to the building. All 21 schools are separate. They only communicate.
There's not a centralized way to communicate to all of them at once.
That's correct. Yes.
Okay.
So yeah.
And then I guess the other question I have that I don't see here, and I know I've beat this drum like 10 times at the end already, but I have a lot of teachers of my kids, and I will be enrolled in sort of their group text for the semester or the year. They can kind of send out whatever they want. Actually, it's kind of hard to get unenrolled in that, but it's pretty easy to get in them. And so I'm kind of curious because, again, with just given what's kind of happened this year, how does a principal very quickly and effectively communicate with teaching staff in a lockdown? And if that can't, I mean, the technology is clearly there. I'm on like 7 or 8 of those with different teachers. So why is that not happening already? It seems like such an easy, sort of quick, you can send out a message that says, hey, the alarm was pulled by a kid, don't panic, and it can just go out like that or whatever it might be. So I just feel like that's something that's really missing from this conversation, is how to communicate to the teachers in real time about what's happening in the building so that you can alleviate panic or make it very clear that this is serious. And so, yeah, I just don't see that anywhere on this list that's otherwise pretty comprehensive.
Right. Yeah, well, we're going to, what we're going to do, if there is a video from the Alice Institute that talks about, as you can see, alert is the number one, is the first thing. The other 4 letters in the acronym can be intertwined. You can change them up. It's not always going to be lockdown, inform, counter, evacuate. Alert is always the first one in everything that they'll show you. So how do we find a better communication method? And so if you watch some of their training videos, they have the text message notification that they recommend using. And we could easily start today with a group me chat or whatever, however the building would want to do it. I think that's something we might just shoot out to our principals and say, from now till May, use one of these, see how you like it. We'll go to training, see if there's a better system out there that makes more sense, and maybe just go with that, and knowing that at least we have something in place before. So
And I also, as we look at those, I think it's important, like, all of our teachers have access to devices, but using those messaging systems will include some of our teachers who don't have cell phones, because I can think of 3 off the top of my head that I know personally that don't have cell phones. So, but they have their iPad, so the messaging would include them, or they have their laptop. But whatever we use, we can't completely rely on cell phone messaging, because we do have teachers without cell phones.
Now, how would that, with the Power School, would it automatically have those notifications? I know with some, that would be a thing with Power School as well, I'm assuming.
you're going down the right road there. There is a way, an app notification through Power School. And I would assume every teacher would download that app. And because it's a very convenient app, and one of the reasons why we like it and are going to it, because it's more comprehensive. So you're exactly right. I appreciate you bringing that up, because that could possibly be a way to communicate effectively.
And that's something we would have to, we'll explore. I see Kevin's face in the back. But there is a way, that app and some things, but we can explore that and look at that so that starting next year, we would have something consistent and in place to be certain of that.
Something that would be standard and district-wide, every building is going to use.
And just so you know, I'm sure you know, but I was talking to a principal who had no clue that there are 2 different Facebook groups that are Lawrence Police Scanner Facebook pages. And so if you are on those and something comes across the police scanner, it is being talked about on social media before the police even may be on the scene. And so, for instance, in that situation with Cordley, you had teachers hearing about things from people outside the building that they were hearing on the police scanner. So I do think we live in a world where sort of that not saying anything is not really an option, because it's already out there.
Right.
Yeah. And then it's misinformation, or, people are starting to sort of panic. Yeah.
Makes sense. Yeah, and Ron was informing me that as through his visits, he said several of the schools are using those apps already. Okay. So it's good to hear. So.
Okay, so additional questions that we want to ask of Tony or Ron in this context? And if not, I have a motion for executive session. We're going to have 15 minutes. How much time? 15 minutes? Yeah. A short executive session. Melissa, did you have a question before we do that?
I know, ideally, we're planning for what if someone was trying to come into the schools, but in some situations, like, are there going to be some talks and planning, like, what happens if they're already there? So that's,
Yeah, this is the tough part about this is it's you think about a fire is a fire. You know, it's in one place and it's static. It's at some point becomes dynamic. And we think about those drills. A tornado is a little bit, you go to the shelter, you know, that's a drill that's the same every time you go out. Every time during a fire drill, you go out to your designated place. During a tornado drill, you go to the tornado shelter. During a lockdown drill, you really have to think and make quick decisions. And so it's not something that it can be, we can give the options, but it's something that the teacher and the students have to make a really split-second decision on how they're going to react. Hence I think the education part of it of here's some material, here's some facts, here's some education on what this might look like, and whatever the frequency is we choose, that we walk through the drills, and maybe we do something different. You know, the first time maybe we go into a lockdown. Maybe the second drill you actually evacuate. And the third drill, maybe we do something different every time so that students and staff become familiar with that. That's the dynamic part of this, is we have a human being, unpredictable human being who is in the building, and you have to just make a decision, and there's nothing that we can tell them to do. We can only inform them of possible options and know that we've tried to present some different options based on history, that we've placed that before them, and that hopefully they can make it what the best decision for them and their students and staff at that time. So I don't know if that's...
It's more of a kind of how to prepare in that flight or fight kind of thing versus being able to assess every single situation.
Yeah,
so I think that's kind of like how to...
Yeah, it's hard too, because like we talked about at the facilities committee, you know, the lockdown of a building is basically initiated anytime anyone breaches the secured entrance who isn't supposed to be there. And that doesn't necessarily mean that that's because they have a weapon. It could be a parent who doesn't have custody of a child who's decided they want to take that child and they breach the secure entrance. So in that case, it has nothing to do with the weapon. It's that someone has breached the secured entrance and they're in the building and the lockdown is initiated. So in that case, just what you're saying, it's almost impossible to plan and prepare for any possible situation. Unlike a fire or a tornado, it's just trying to help staff and teachers understand what it means, the difference between a lockdown and a lockout, and how to make the best decisions possible in any given situation.
And the more we'll, within reason, you know, the school day is busy already, but we'll continue to work with teachers and principals to say what a good frequency is for these drills without causing, you know, too much disruption to the day or mental health. So that's the other part of it too. So.
Okay. With that, if we're ready, for our motion, I move the Board of Education recess to executive session to discuss district crisis plans and safety and security measures pursuant to the exception under COMA for school security matters to ensure the security of the school, its buildings, and/or its systems are not jeopardized, with Anna Stubblefield, Tony Barron, Ron Mays, and David Cunningham invited to be present, and the board to return to open session in this room at 7:45 with possible action to follow. Oh, I'm sorry, 8:45. I've been looking at that all night and adding an hour, and I just forgot to do that.
It's 5 minutes.
Oh, okay, 15 minutes. So 8:55, thank
Whatever
you.
that adds up to, Dawn.
Everybody in favor? Aye?
Aye.
Thank you. 8:55.
I was like, wait a minute, that's not...
have any action to take after our session, so just need a motion to adjourn.
So moved. Oh, second.
All in favor? Aye. Thank you all very much for being here this evening.
Yeah, exactly.